Hello everyone, Sombre here. This is going to be another national overview of a Warhammer mod nation for Dominions 5. Today we'll be looking at the Skaven. As usual, I will put in the description which version I used of the Skaven individual mod and of the compilation mod pack, Sombre Warhammer. You can use either, so you can have just the Skaven mod, or you can have all the latest versions of the Warhammer mods all enabled at once. I'll also be following the usual structure, which is that we'll take a look at the recruitable troops, take a look at the recruitable commanders, we'll look at multi-heroes, unique heroes that you get through events, any national mechanics, any summons, things like that, extra units and commanders, national spells. There are no national items for the Skaven at the moment. And then we'll have a little look at pretender selection very briefly, and we will look at the recommended scales for playing with Skaven, although once again this isn't really intended to be a guide, it's just an overview and something to whet your appetite, maybe encourage you to give Skaven a go. Here is the national overview screen for Skaven Blight. So like the ogres, and like various other Warhammer mod nations, they're not called just Skaven, they're called Skaven Blight because that is the name of their homeland. And of course, Dominions names the province that you start in after your homeland, unless you've got a particular custom map. They're called Skaven Blight, Rise of the Under Empire. They are a race of malevolent rat men that live in the underground of the Warhammer world. You can read this description by pausing it and having a look. But let's quickly go through the national features. So they are a race of rat men. They're stealthy. They all have minor poison and disease resistance. They have mountain survival, and they are good at sieging. Their military is made up of massed infantry, experimental fire, shock, and poison weapons, and mutated beasts. They don't have any cavalry, you'll note. Their magic is death, earth, fire, blood, and some astral. Their priests are powerful. They've got holy threes in the form of their grey seers. Though those are capital only. They have holy twos that they can build anywhere. And they can perform blood sacrifices. So they don't have a dominion that is dying like Mictlands or anything like that. They're more like Vanheim in that they just, as a supplement to their dominion, can perform blood sacrifices. And having holy threes that can perform blood sacrifices is nice because they can do 3 slaves per turn. So you can push your dominion a bit. Their special mechanics are that they can discover Warpstone sites, exhaust them, and then potentially reopen them with labs. And as with the other Warhammer nations, they have unique heroes who are not tied to the luck scale. They just get the standard forts, and those cost the standard amount for them. Everything else is normal temple cost, normal lab cost. Their starting sites, they have the Undercity, which gives you 1 fire and 1 earth per turn. They have the Pillars of Skavenblight, which is how you get your capital only mage. They give you 1 death and 1 astral per turn, so quite a broad selection of gems, and then the council chambers, which gives you 1 death. So death is your highest income, and this enables the recruitment of your sacred, which is capital only, the council guard. As with my other mod nations, I also give some preview sites that allow you to see what your summons are. So you've got your list of summons here. You can see what your luck-based multi-heroes are, which is just the Grey Seer, and you can see these luck-independent or unique event-based heroes. So to reiterate, these don't care what your luck scale is. You can take Misfortune 3 and these will still show up, but if you took Misfortune 3 you wouldn't get any multi-heroes. If you take Luck 3 you'll get more multi-heroes, but it has no impact on these luck-independent heroes. They're just a percentage chance of appearing each turn, and they're limited in which turns they can appear. Now let's talk about the troops. We'll start with the very weakest and cheapest troops. You can see the Skaven have a lot of troops, and much of it is kind of specialized infantry. So their first 3 units here are different types of Skaven Slave. The Skaven Slave has many of the attributes that are common to all Skaven. It has 25% disease resistance. They're a little bit more resistant to disease than you might expect. They have a little bit of poison resistance, 2 poison resistance, and they are stealthy. And they've got 10 over the normal amount of stealthy, so even these slaves, your worst units, are still pretty stealthy. And that represents that the Skaven are a very sneaky and cunning race, but also that they travel underground for the most part. They tunnel underneath things. They haven't got the organized tunnels that let them constantly tunnel under rivers and different types of territory and so on that the dwarf rune runners have. So they don't have all of the survivals you might get from tunneling around, but they are able to hide whenever they want, so they are stealthy. They also have mountain survival because they're naturally able to tunnel around inside the mountains rather well. That's kind of a natural home for the Skaven. And they all come with very good dark vision. They have excellent ability to see in the dark. 75% is good enough that you can do very well in things like caves or if there's supernatural darkness. And then the Skaven slaves have very bad stats, although they are slaves, which means they have halved upkeep in gold, and they are also they get a bonus if they have a taskmaster commander leading them. So there are some taskmasters available to the Skaven, and then they are very, very cheap. So the Skaven slave is very nice because he gives you decent siege strength, 0.6 decent siege defense. He gives you, his stats are not good at all, but he gives you some hit points that can stand there and take lance hits and so on. He has, they can kind of club things. They can do okay in melee. I really wouldn't suggest expecting them to do anything particularly useful in melee. They're not really going to kill very much or injure very much. But what you have here is kind of a classic, very, very cheap, because 3 gold is extremely cheap for a unit like this, slave that will allow you to use them to just absorb casualties. You can use them to siege. You can use them to patrol as well. They're not undisciplined. They can follow orders, so their patrol strength is absolutely fine. They're like most Skaven. They're quite fast on their feet. So yeah, you've got a good patroller here, a good sieger, and a good kind of chaff unit. They have terrible morale, of course. They'll run away, but you can boost up the morale of Skaven, and you will find, looking through Skaven, that morale in general is a problem. They're a very self-centered race, and they believe that discretion is the better part of valor, so they're quite happy to run away. Let's move on to the next slave, who is a little bit better equipped. So all of his stats are very similar. He's got slightly more hit points because he's a little bit better fed than the other slaves. These are basically the healthier or tougher slaves who've managed to grab some of the equipment for themselves. And the main difference here is that he does have a shield and he does have a spear. He is, however, in addition to being more in resource cost, he is more gold. Extra point of gold is, of course, 1/3 more expensive than the base Skaven. So if you just want one for the purposes of patrolling and you're not expecting them to do any fighting, then do not get this slave, get the one with the club, get the cheap one. If you're expecting them to do some fighting, I actually find that this Skaven slave is not bad, even though you get fewer of them for the gold, just because this shield means that they sometimes will survive a hit. They manage to block up their shield. The spear can help them occasionally get a repel in, or avoid being repelled, so they can fare a little bit better in combat. So I would say if you want them to kind of absorb the brunt of enemy charge, something like that, maybe the Skaven slave spear is a better choice if you've got the resources to buy it. Then we have another slave, which is actually quite a feature of the unit. Oh, and I should say that all of these slaves can be recruited outside of forts. So you don't need a fort to recruit them. You can get them from wherever, and they're not dependent on dominion or scales or anything like that. So if you conquer a province and you're able to hold it for a turn, you can just get some slaves there. And because they're so cheap in recruitment points, resources, and gold, you can end up getting quite a few, which is very nice. So you can use these to replenish the ones that you inevitably will lose in combat. So the Slinger has very similar stats to the basic Skaven slave. He costs a little bit more in recruitment points and considerably more in gold. That's nearly twice as much now. So that's he's a 166% as expensive as the basic Skaven slave. So I wouldn't recommend using the Slinger for sieging and patrolling. That's you use the basic Skaven slave for that. I wouldn't recommend using them to stand around and take enemy charges because they have even less armor than the basic Skaven slave. What they bring to the table is that they have a sling. And having a sling at 5 gold and very easily massable and stealthy is quite nice because slings can be useful against things that have very low protection. They can be useful for forcing morale checks and so on. But primarily, the great benefit of having a 5 gold slinger is if you get flaming arrows up, which this nation can absolutely do, it has the fire magic to do flaming arrows quite easily, then you can have a big mass of Skaven slave slingers. You can use this tactic a few times if you get to flaming arrows quickly, or if the opponent doesn't know you're at flaming arrows, and you can have all these flaming slings output quite a lot of fire damage to the enemy. So that can be pretty strong. Another use of these slingers is that they count as archers. So if you're trying to fool the enemy scripting, because you have other ranged units which are over here, the weapons teams, which are very valuable to protect. If the enemy says fire archers, they could end up firing at the weapons teams, but you can use Skaven slave slingers to decoy them. Next, we have another unit that can be recruited outside of forts, the basic Clan Rat Spear. So this is where we see the kind of racial profile of the Skaven writ large. He has the same poison resistance and stealth as the others, mounted survival, dark vision. But now we're also gaining a siege bonus of 1. And a siege bonus of 1 on a 7 gold unit that already has OK strength means that you end up with siege strength 1.8 for 7 gold. And that is amongst the best siege strength gold that you can get, full stop. It is just fantastic. It means that you, particularly because you can recruit these anywhere, you have basically no excuse for not being able to very quickly crack into forts. That's a feature of the Skaven. It's a national strength, and it's because they can just, they are rats. They can gnaw and tunnel their way into anything. They can get in anywhere. Other than that, we're looking at a, fairly decent unit for the cost. For 7 gold, you get something that can hold its own in a fight a little bit. It's got OK protection. He's got a shield. His defense skill is actually a base of 11 because of their fast rat-like reflexes, plus the shield parry. He actually ends up with an OK defense skill, so he will block some things with his shield. He doesn't hit terribly hard, of course, because it's just a spear, and Skaven are a bit smaller than humans, a bit slighter, so they have lower strength and lower hit points than humans. But for 7 gold, you will find that the Clan Rat Spear can do just fine. They'll outnumber the enemy almost certainly, and the spear is not a terrible weapon. Their main problem is that they don't really have the damage output to get through high protection, so they won't do well against elite troops at all. But you can use these, much like you can with the slaves, as an option for just kind of holding the enemy in place, but one that instead of being useless at fighting and dying very quickly is slower to die and actually can do a bit of damage, can kind of hold their own. A way that I use the Clan Rats quite often is because they are decent at fighting province defense, not good, but decent at fighting province defense. You can take a group of Clan Rats because you can build them anywhere. You can take one of your stealthy leaders and you can lead them around to do stealth raids on enemy province defense. So they can be very useful for that. Very low in recruitment points. Their main bottleneck is going to be resources and gold for the most part. So similar to the relationship between the Skaven Slave and the Skaven Slave Spear, we then have an upgraded version of the Clan Rat. He costs 1 more gold, although proportionally that's less of an issue than the Skaven Slave going up in 1 gold cost, and he has better weapons and equipment. It's really that simple. So higher resource cost, same recruitment point cost, a little bit extra gold cost. Instead of a spear, you have a Falchion, or Falchion, not sure how that's pronounced, and that is just a better weapon, really. It means that you can be repelled a bit more because it's a low length weapon, you won't get the repels off, but it does so much more damage, which is better. It makes up a bit for the fact they've got this low strength. And then their equipment's better. They just have a little bit better armor and so on, so much more survivable. If you have the resources to get these Clan Rats, I would recommend getting them over the Clan Rats with spears. And they can be an okay resource dump if you've got a surfeit of resources. Get these Clan Rats, and they're, it's still very cheap in gold cost. We're still talking about 8 gold when 10 is kind of the basic cost for a human soldier. Now we are getting to the specialist troops. We have the Night Runner. This is from Clan Eshin, so one of the great clans of the Skaven. And Clan Eshin are a little bit Oriental coded, and they are they use kind of stealth. They're kind of like the ninja and assassin-y and stealthy clan. They have much stronger units than this. This is their lowest tier units, the Night Runner. Night Runners are fast. They have, for the Skaven, OK morale at 9. They have got a short sword, which is a fairly decent weapon. It's good for stats at least. It gives you +1 attack, +1 defense, which is quite nice. And they have a net, and a net is a fantastic weapon in Dominions. It guarantees tangling up the enemy for 1 turn, potentially more than 1 turn if they're not able to get out of the net. I think the net tests their strength checks. I think it's strength. So against low strength enemies, the net can be very good. When they're netted and entangled up in the net, they have very low defense, almost no defense, I think, and so they will get hit. So you can pair the Night Runners up. You can use them to, you can pair them up with high damage things that hit hard, which is nice, and don't particularly have very high attack because the net will allow almost anything to hit the enemy that's entangled. And you can use them to delay the enemy, hold them in place with the net. Just generally very useful. They cost quite a lot more in recruitment points than the other Skaven, so you're a bit more limited in how many of these you can get, but they're still overall very cheap, and their stats are fairly good. They have the base defense skill, they have the OK attack, and they're still only 8 gold. So I would say Night Runners are very nice. I often use them on attack cavalry because they can go and net the cavalry, which negates their advantages in defense and their ability to avoid harassment and so on. Very nice. They also have a little bit of extra stealth, but I'm not sure how much that matters really, or the other Skaven tend to be stealthy enough to not get caught. Then there is a version of the Night Runner that doesn't have a net and a short sword. He instead has a dagger, which is not a very good melee weapon, and a sling, although he does gain a buckler, which gives them a little bit more survivability. He's basically the same cost as the other one, but a lot less in resources. And generally speaking, I would not recommend the Night Runner Slinger. I think that you'd rather take the Skaven Slave Slinger, but there are cases where the Night Runner, with his better map move and a little bit better precision and just generally better stats, you may wish to take him, just to get some extra slingers, basically. Again, I wouldn't really recommend these without flaming arrows. I think slings on their own are not very exciting, especially for the gold cost when you've got a 5 gold slinger you could have. But you may think that the extra 3 gold is worth it to get these guys in if you have the recruitment points to mass them. So it's just another option for a slinger, which I think is slightly less good, but an option. Now we have the tier 1, the low-level Pestilence clan troop. So the Pestilens are religious fanatics and they worship disease and corruption. They're almost the kind of the Nurgle aligned force in the Skaven, although they still worship the Horned Rat, who's like a 5th Chaos God. So they're not quite worshipping Nurgle, but they really do worship disease and pestilence and corruption and so on. So one of the things they gain from that is that they have double the poison resistance 4. Poison resistance 4 is not enough to ignore poison, like foul vapors, things like that, by any means, but it does keep the amount of damage they take from poison down a little bit. They also have better disease resistance. They have 50 instead of 25, which can be quite useful. They also gain swamp survival, so if you have to cross through swamp provinces, they get to keep their higher map move. Finally, they are Berserkers, and Berserker 2 is a pretty decent value. This isn't entirely the kind of unit that benefits a lot from Berserk. It benefits from the morale, certainly, and you can see their base morale is okay for the Skaven, because 10 is actually pretty good for a Ratman. But yeah, the benefit that they get from Berserker is really their attack skill and strength going up, so they get to hit harder with their short sword, but they don't really get to benefit from the protection, because losing their defense skill and gaining that protection, they're still just going to end up taking lots of damage, lots of hits, so they are going to be not very survivable, which often means they get hit hard enough it just kills them, they don't get to use their Berserk. So a little bit of a double-edged sword having the Berserk, but you can see that this unit has 2 attacks, it's size 2, so you can get 3 of them in a square and output 6 attacks. And that can be very nice. It's kind of a feature that you can output so many attacks from one square. It's nice to have these guys. The short sword is a decent weapon, and then they have the Pestilent Bite. So Pestilent Bite is a normal bite, except if it manages to damage, it can do disease, although magic resistant negates. But if you are having lots of bites raining down on things, you can get some through, and even things that have pretty good magic resistance can end up being diseased. So that's a feature, is that you can end up diseasing elite enemy units, but in the process your Plague Monks will probably die, so I wouldn't really rely on it as anything great, but it can be a nice annoyance to the enemy. Really, the benefit of the Plague Monk is that he is low in resource cost. He is away, he's basically bottlenecked by gold rather than other things. So if you've got plenty of gold, you need lots of troops. Maybe you could use the Plague Monks in expansion. Then their lower recruitment points, and 5 is the same as the Clan Rats, and then their resource costs being low makes them quite attractive for the amount of offensive output. So really kind of strong light infantry, but quite susceptible to getting killed. Then we have what makes up the Skaven sort of elite infantry, and I'm putting elite in air quotes a little bit because they are still Skaven. So while they have very good strength, while they have these are above average for human hit points and strength. They have nice attack skill of 11. They have a defense skill of 12. They've got the kind of racial +1 to that. They've still got pretty good combat speed because they're Skaven. So again, combat speed is important when you are when the enemy has routed. You can chase them down and kill them. It's good to mean that you get the first hit in combat. That can be a nice feature of it, and particularly because these guys hit very hard for a Skaven, at least very hard. It also can allow you to run away successfully, which the Skaven are very keen on. You can see that even though these are the elite, so-called elite, they still only have 9 morale. So you're definitely going to have issues with your troops running away, breaking, particularly when a side route starts to happen and you're getting these morale checks all over your forces. You'll just have loads of them start running away. So it can definitely be an issue. But at least when they run away, they're more likely to escape than most heavy infantry. Would I actually class the Storm Vermin as heavy infantry? I'm not sure. They certainly hit like heavy infantry. They do. They have a very nice hit with the glaive. It's length 3, difficult to repel and so on, and it can get repels in. The glaive does come with -1 attack, which is, it means that they're not attacking at their full potential of 11. If they were holding a sword, that'd be a 12, and they could, realistically get past shields and very often hit things. So you have to bear in mind that they're not super accurate because of this big heavy glaive. Their protection is not amazing. The scale mill halberd is not really a particularly great piece of armor for the middle era. 14 protection overall. I would class them as a kind of like halfway between medium and heavy infantry. They're certainly capable of hitting hard. I end up building a lot of storm vermin. If you want your infantry to actually kill things, go to the front and do some damage, then the storm vermin are good, and they're less likely to run away. They have morale 9 versus the clan rats morale of 8, so they are more likely to stick around in the fight. So I do use quite a lot of storm vermin. Here is another. Actually, I should point out that you cannot get. So these are the units you can recruit outside of any fort. So this is the clan rat spear and the basic Skaven slaves. Then clan rats you can only get in forts, except if you have a cave province. You can then get them outside of forts. So cave province can be quite nice to get these higher resource cost ones. And then night runner slingers, plague monks, storm vermin. All of these other units basically are not recruited outside of forts. So if you're outside of the forts, basically you're going to be getting either slaves or the basic clan rat spear. Now we're moving on to another sort of elite unit, the gutter runner. And now we are talking about some serious gold costs. So this is 7 more gold than the storm vermin, who, he is kind of underpriced for being a good quality infantry. You might expect him to cost 12, 13, 14 gold. The gutter runner, I would say, is slightly overpriced. And when I'm talking about underpriced or overpriced, I'm not necessarily saying like, oh, you definitely want to buy the underpriced stuff and definitely don't want to buy something that's overpriced. Because the question of whether you buy it and whether you're okay with it being under or overpriced is really to do with what you actually need. And the gutter runner gives you something that none of your other troops really give you. So they've got higher morale, they've got much better training than the other Skaven, their stats are very good, they have okay hit points and strength, they're more based on skill than brawn, unlike the storm vermin. They are limited in recruitment, you can only get 5 of them per turn. Their resource cost is not super high, but it's not nothing, so you may get bottlenecked on resource cost, and of course 18 gold is very expensive. They have okay protection, it's not great really, so they're kind of still light infantry bordering on medium infantry. But what the gutter runners have going for them is a suite of good skills. They have higher stealth, they have swimming, so they can cross over rivers without them being frozen. They have 3 siege bonus instead of 1, so these guys can output a frankly massive amount of siege strength because gutter runners are infiltrators and tunnelers par excellence. Siege strength for 18 gold is perfectly fine. Of course, you do have your clan rats at 7 gold that give you a good amount of siege, so they're not probably the most efficient in terms of gold cost, but it's good to know that you can move a small group of these in and they will give you a lot of extra siege strength. And then their great ability in combat is that their weapons are fantastic. So they have 2 gutter blades, each of which is like a short sword that does weak poison if it manages to damage. And weak poison on damage is quite nice. It will allow you to, if you're not getting top penetration, which of course you're not very hard hitting, but you can do pierce damage. So you might be getting very low damage chip attacks through higher protection enemies. And that will allow you the poison to get to work and kill them off eventually. So that can be very nice. They have 2 of these, so 2 attacks. They are at attack 12, very nice. And then they also have a pretty good ranged weapon, the Ashin Shuriken, which is very similar to the shuriken used by the ninja of Jomon. And they're strength-based throwing weapons. They don't do a huge amount of damage. You've only got 4 shots with them, but if they do hit, they do weak poison. And just having these extra ranged units who can toss in a few rounds of shuriken and then getting to close combat and chop things up can be very strong. I've had really good results using small squads of gutter runners. Maybe you've got 10 gutter runners led by a stealthy commander. They can go and take out province defense with very few losses. So I would say the gutter runners are good. Definitely get some. If you get them early on, you're using them for expansion, things like that. You can have the gutter runners just kind of stay back and use their missile weapons and not get into melee. But then when they do run out, or if they do get into melee, they're pretty tasty in melee. So I'm kind of a big fan of the gutter runners, and I think they're definitely worth getting some. Then we have your capital-only sacred, Council Guard. So the Council Guard is like a storm vermin who has been really souped up. his physical stats are excellent. 12 strength, 13 hit points is very nice. They don't have any built-in natural protection, but their armor is fine. It's the same as the Storm Vermin's. Their weapon is the glaive, same as the Storm Vermin's, but then their attack and defense is better than the Storm Vermin's, and their morale is perhaps the most exciting thing about them. They have 12 morale, which for the Skaven is ferociously brave. And these guys can really hold a line. They can kill things with their glaives. They can stay alive okay. They are cheap, 22 gold each. I would say that they are not a unit you want to take a very strong bless on, but they're worth a bless, and they are worth considering having a relatively high Dominion score or building a lot of temples so that you can crank these out from your capital. Because they're basically, I would say, for the gold cost resource and so on, I would prefer them over Storm Vermin always. So if you can get Council Guard and use them to kind of anchor your line, they can kill tough stuff. They're just very reliable compared to everything else, and just having some troops that are reliable, that can do well in combat and won't just run away instantly, is a big thing for the Skaven. You also get a patrol bonus of 1, so they are pretty good patrollers, although you have plenty of other options for gold efficiency. They're not bad patrollers if you need them to patrol. They have the same racial bonuses as the Skaven, so the siege bonus and so on, but then they also have Bodyguard. Bodyguard 2 is very nice because you have some mages that do need protecting, and you can chuck some Council Guard on them as bodyguards, and they will keep them pretty safe. That's good against even when the enemy has pretty decent assassins or ones that have patience. They'll be able to avoid bodyguards, but they're less likely to because of this bodyguard rating. Not much else to say about the Council Guard. Even if you don't have a bless whatsoever, I would still recommend recruiting some of them at least. I would probably still take them over Storm Vermin, even if you don't have a bless, just to have reliable troops with better stats. Then you have your Sacred that can be built anywhere, the Censer Bearer. The Censer Bearer is very different from the Council Guard. It basically wants quite a different bless. There are some blesses that would work with both of them, but generally speaking, to play to the strength of the Censer Bearer and to shore up some of its weaknesses, it's quite different from the one you would take off for the Council Guard. Censer Bearers are Pestilent Skaven, so they have the typical Berserk, although it's at Berserk 3. They have the higher poison resistance at 4. They have death resistance at disease resistance rather at 50%. Death resistance at 50% would be very nice, but they don't have that. They are undisciplined, which can be a big problem for the purposes of scripting. It means that they're not as good for siege defenses and so on, although you probably don't care about that for this unit. The main thing is that you just can't reliably give them scripting and orders and things. They just run off and do whatever they want because they are quite mad by the fumes in their sensors. They have good physical stats, 11 strength, 14 hit points is very high for a Skaven. They have excellent morale, starting morale of 12, same as the Council Guard, because they are quite frenzied, and of course they go berserk, and then that goes up to 99. And they have, while they have, poor protection, they do have some basic natural protection built in because of the toughness granted to them from diseases ravaging their body. And they have an excellent weapon, the Plague Censer. So the Plague Censer is basically a flail. It gets 2 attacks, it gets +2 attacks versus shield, and it does okay damage. It's a 2-handed weapon. So they hit hard. You can see 19, pretty decent whacks they can do with their 2-handed flail. But then also they have the Incense Cloud, and you don't have to do damage to get the Incense Cloud. It's just whenever you swing your weapon, this gets generated. And this is Area of Effect 3, 3 armor negating poison damage, so it's poison gas. The 3 damage from that will get through your own poison resistance relatively often, but it won't get through it that much, and you can usually tank it with your hit points. So they don't typically kill themselves, but it is worth bearing in mind that their Incense Cloud being Area of Effect 3, it can hit themselves, it can hit friendlies that are next to them and so on, but it can also hit a lot of enemy troops, and again, you don't need to hit them with your big whirly flail, you just need to swing it. And you get 2 swings with your big whirly flail each turn, so that's 2 of these poison clouds they're generating, each of them each turn. They're size 2, so you can fit 3 of them to a square. So if you think about that, it's an output of 6 attacks from the Plague Sensors per square and 6 of these poison clouds. So think about 6 3 poison armor negating blasts each turn coming from a square. If the enemy has no poison resistance whatsoever, they will simply get killed by Censer Bearers. They will probably kill you in return because you don't have very good stats or protection. So Censer Bearers die very quickly. But just being able to output that much poison gas into the air is pretty dangerous, really. You can end up killing your own troops, of course, and that is a theme with this game. There's a lot of stuff where you can kill your own side. But if you're up against elite enemies that you just have to kill, they don't have poison resistance, and maybe they're lots of gold, you know, if you're talking about very elite special cavalry, things like that, they don't have lots of hit points, they don't have regeneration, you can just poison their asses. So that's what the Sensor Bearer is for. I wouldn't really recommend going extremely heavy on the Bless for these guys, even though they're a Recruit Anywhere Sacred and they're not very expensive. The fact that they just constantly die is going to mean that you're not going to get a massive amount of value for a very heavy Bless, but definitely worth considering when you're taking your Bless. Even if you don't have a Bless, they're a way of outputting lots of poison damage, and they are pretty reliable and they hit very hard, so good against high protection, high defense enemy elites. Next, we have the start of these kind of special units, which are presented by Clan Molder and Clan Scryer. Scryer is the technological kind of steampunk clan, and the Poison Wind Globadier is the first of these. I believe these are recruitment limited to 2 per turn, so that's in a fort, you can get 2 of them each turn. They require a lab. All of the Clan Scryer units, I believe, require a lab. If you do have a lab, you can build Poison Wind Globadiers. They're expensive. They cost a lot of resources, and of course they're limited to 2 per turn. But what you do get from the Poison Wind Globadiers is you get excellent siege bonus of 3, so you know, very high siege strength we're talking about, because they can just gas the enemies by throwing in these glass gas globes, snow globes full of gas. And in combat, they can hurl these Poison Wind globes. Anything that gets hit by them will take a tiny amount of damage. You know, they're very, very low damage in terms of just hitting things. But it then releases the Poison Wind, which is very similar to the Sensor Bearer's gas. It's in a smaller area of effect, and it does more damage, 5 poison damage. So if the enemy doesn't have poison defense, you can have these guys backing up your troops. They get 6 ammunition each, so they can stand behind your front line of troops, and they can just hurl these gas, almost like gas grenades over the top. Very, very nasty indeed. Then we have Clan Molder's contribution, the Rat Ogre. These are recruitment limited to 1 per turn, I believe. Don't require any resources, very limited in the way of rec points as well. That's not really relevant to them. So it's basically just gold and the fact you can only get 1 per turn. But for 35 gold, you get, it's still stealthy, it's still a Skaven, so it still has poison resistance, but you get a big chunk of hit points with extremely high strength that also goes berserk. It is also undisciplined, you can't control them. So if you've got a little group of these, you know, you've got 5 or 6 of them, you may want to put them back because they're quite fast behind your lines, and then as your lines are fighting, you want the Rat Ogres to charge in. If you have them just charging at the front, they don't have good protection. These hit points will not save them. They don't have good defense. They will just get chopped up. You know, they just take full damage hits from things. They're size 3 and they have 2 attacks each, so they can output decent attack density per square. But really, you want to use Rat Ogres with things that can support them, things that can kind of hold the enemy in place, and then the Rat Ogres can jump on them. I haven't had a great deal of success with these as a recruitable. You can't get a huge number of them, but you can try out how you do with them. Get a few of them if you're just, you know, early on you just want to put gold into troops. Maybe you can get some Rat Ogres. They can be useful as a recruitable to just have sacks of hit points with not very good magic resistance, because that can draw certain spells and enemy fire and things like that. But of course, they're not scriptable. Yeah, they're not bad. I think they suffer a lot from enemies that can repel them. There are a few enemies who are very good at repel, and if they're up against fire shields or anything, they have these length 0 attacks, which can be a problem. And they're not super hard hitting despite their very high strength. But yeah, give them a try, and remember that they're of course also a blood summon you can get, which we'll discuss later. Oh, I should note that this is true of the Rat Ogre and a few other units, that because there's a big upfront cost to them, because you're just buying them from a clan that's just charging you money for them, their upkeep is actually reduced. They don't have the upkeep of 35 gold units. They have less upkeep than that. So it's 8 gold a year is less than you would pay for a 35 gold unit typically. That's also true of the Poison Wind Globadiers and of all these units that are from Clan Scryer. Next, we have an absolutely iconic weapon of the Skaven, which is the Warp Fire Thrower team. So Warp Fire Throwers are basically flamethrowers. They are similar to the kind of attacks you get from like the old Drakes in the older Dominions games, and the Grotesque, I believe it's called, in Dominions 5, where they'll shoot this blast of flame. If you think of it as kind of like a long-range grenade almost, like it shoots a blast of flame rather than it coming out in a cone in front of it, it arcs over, and then where it lands does some area effect. So area effect 2, 15 armor piercing fire damage, so very nasty. If things don't have extremely high protection or fire resistance, they will get obliterated by the Warpfire Thrower quite often. Super inaccurate and not fantastic range either. So the Warpfire Thrower is very unreliable in terms of hitting the enemy, and a lot of the times it will roast your own troops. If you can get fire resistance on your troops, that's very nice to ignore the warp fire being thrown around, but it does hit very hard, so it would have to be very high fire resistance for you to actually ignore the shots. This is kind of hard to use and script and get placed correctly. Once you get the hang of it, though, you can use it and you can have lots of cheap troops that are up front that if you don't care if it misses and roasts your own troops, that is the Skaven way of things. That's why this is an iconic unit. You're basically sending in a bunch of chaff of these cheap units that you don't really care about, and then you're having the Warpfire Thrower teams just roast everything, friend and foe alike, just blasting flame all over the place. They can be a bit of a scripting challenge. They're somewhat expensive. You only get one of them per turn, and their resource cost is very high, which is one of the reasons that you might be taking production scales, for instance. But so you're quite limited in how many of these you will have. But over the course of the game, they don't tend to die that often. If they do get killed, then they explode in a blast of flame, which can kill other weapons teams that are near to them or friendlies that are near to them. So you may want to spread them out a little bit, or that can be hard to do. Their protection is not bad. They wear somewhat heavy armor because they want to protect themselves from the flames and enemy arrows and so on. They're stealthy. They have excellent siege bonus, of course, because they're a flamethrower, very useful for doing sieges. They have a bit of fire resistance, so they can resist somewhat their own exploding friends or their own blasts of fire from other places. Very, very, very fun to use, very amusing. Sometimes they will completely screw up. I had it happen in a game recently. I sent a force that could easily take, it was like 5 province defense, so I was fighting, or 6 province defense, and I had like 20 clan rats there. It could have easily have taken it, but I had one Warpfire Thrower with them, and instead of firing into the enemy, he basically just fired into my clan rats 3 times in a row, burned them all, and then we all ran away. So we didn't take the very weak province defense. If he hadn't been there, we would have been able to do it. So they can be a bit of a liability sometimes. As with the other Scryer things, they require a lab, and you get reduced upkeep on them, and you only get 1 per turn. This is true for all of these. 1 per turn, require a lab, reduced upkeep. The Doomflayer is a melee weapons team, so he has built-in shock resistance, which can be quite nice. He has an attack that can do quite a lot of repelling, the Whirling Blades. It is 6 armor piercing damage, and it is better against smaller beings, so he is size 3. So this is really designed for chopping up infantry. It does double damage against infantry, and it's armor piercing, so it can hit infantry very hard. It has a huge number of attacks, 4. So if you are facing elite infantry, size 2 things, the Doomflayer team, if it can get there and stay alive, can absolutely chop them up with the Whirling Blades attack. You can put these in with your infantry and they will help them. They're relatively fast, although not as fast as some of the other infantry, but combat speed 13 is, I think, the same as the Storm Vermin, so you can mix these in with Storm Vermin. They have decent protection, and they have the Whirling Blades, which are basically a very good shield, very high protection, and then decent parry. So that gives them a good defense skill for the purposes of keeping themselves alive. I like the Doomflayer plenty. He doesn't have a siege bonus. You cannot use the Doomflayer in sieges, basically. He doesn't even have the 1 siege bonus that Skaven racial bonus gives them. He's really just there to, he can knock arrows out the air with the Whirling Blades, and he can kill infantry. He's there to kind of bolster your melee abilities. I don't think they're as useful as the other weapons teams, but I do build some Doomflayers to kind of help my troops take things. And they can be useful in fort stormings. You can put them at the front to go in fort stormings. That can be quite good. Then we have another iconic weapon of the Skaven, the Warp Lightning Thrower team. So on the tabletop, this is a Warp Lightning cannon, but I don't particularly like having these big cumbersome like siege engines on the battlefield of minions, so I've converted it into a Warp Lightning Thrower, like the Warpfire Thrower. So instead of hurling big blasts of fire out in big gouts of fire, this fires 5 bits of Warp Lightning. Each of them hits 1 target, so it's not area effect, but you do get a lot of shots. They are armor negating, which is absolutely fantastic for a recruitable unit to have armor negating. You might think, well, that's a bit broken, maybe. Well, sort of. They do magic shock damage. It's 9, which is not super high, but it can still get through, basic shock resistance, and it can certainly mess things up. If they don't have any shock resistance and they're relying on protection, they can get absolutely annihilated by the Warp Lightning Thrower. It's very inaccurate. It's longer ranged, and it has 6 ammunition, same as the Warpfire Thrower. You will inflict a lot of friendly fire with this. Although this is not the type of attack that you're super worried about, because you don't really rely on your very high protection. So the Warp Lightning Thrower, I would say, is a bit less likely to do catastrophic friendly fire to you than the Warp Fire Thrower. That's one of the reasons that it is more expensive in gold and resources. It's 50. The Warp Fire Thrower is 45, so it's a bit extra. The Warp Lightning Thrower is excellent at slaughtering enemy elites and things that rely on protection, of course. If they don't have shock resistance, this can make their day an absolute nightmare. It can fire at a longer range. I find that it tends to be a bit more accurate just because it has more projectiles going out there, even though it doesn't have area effect. It's a better range, so as they get closer, its accuracy is a little bit better. I would take these over Warp Fire Throwers against troops that have higher protection. You're basically going to be getting both when you're getting one, because you're going to get one of each. So each turn you might decide to go a Warp Lightning Thrower, a Warp Fire Thrower, and 2 Poison Wind Globadiers maybe, or a Doom Flare or something like that. Yeah, pretty strong. The Poison Wind Mortar is their third type of kind of elemental weapons team. Again, you can get 1 per turn. This has very long range, a range of 40. Considering the other weapons teams only go to, I think it's range 13 and 16, this has much longer range than them. So you set these at the back of your forces and firing over the top. They really are mortars. And this is basically a souped up version of Poison Wind Grenades. So for 30 gold, you get the Poison Wind Globe. He gets to throw that 6 times. He throws one of them. It does less damage. Its impact isn't very high, and it does 5 armor negating poison damage. This has a Poisoned Wind Vortex, which is 6 armor negating damage and area effect 5. So more than twice the area effect of the Poison Wind Globes, and 10 ammunition, so they can keep firing for a long time. These are absolutely fantastic. If you're good at scripting and you predict what the enemy are going to do, you may be able to hit enemy mages and things with them by aiming at things that are near to the mages. I would always bring Poison Wind Mortars. One of the problems with them is that let's say you defeat some province defense, something like that, and you're chasing the enemy off the battlefield, these guys can end up firing these poison clouds that hit your own troops, and then you can take a lot of poison damage. Ideally, it is better to use these with pestilence troops that have the better poison resistance. They have their poison resistance built into these. Very good, but they're also the most expensive in terms of resource cost and gold cost. I like them a lot. If the enemy gets poison resistance up, though, unlike the Warp Lightning Thrower and unlike the Warp Fire Thrower and so on the Doom Flare, if they get the right resistance up, these guys have become basically useless, because if they have enough, if the enemy has like 10-15 poison resistance, you're not going to get through with your Poison Vortex, and your physical attack is terrible. It doesn't do anything. So they can become obsoleted by things. Against certain nations, they've got tons of poison resistant stuff, and the Poison Wind Mortar is going to be useless. The AI also doesn't know not to fire this at things that are immune to poison, because it does physical damage as its primary attack. If the enemy's using a load of Long Dead or something completely immune to poison, and the script is such that they would fire at them, they will fire at them, which is a complete waste. And if you've got troops attacking them, then your troops may end up getting poisoned. That is all of your recruitable units. Let's have a quick look in the summons. I will cover summons more in detail when I'm looking at national spells or commanders or things that give you these summons, but it's worth noting that you do have the Giant Rat. This is the main one that I would look at here, which is something that the Pack Masters give you. So when we're looking at the Pack Masters, we need to consider the Giant Rat. We'll talk about that a bit more when we get to the Pack Masters. Now that we've talked about the rather extensive troop lineup, let's talk about the commanders. So starting off, we have 2 units that are recruitable anywhere outside of forts as well as in forts, which is quite a strength of the nation actually. First is that they have a scout that is only 20 gold. They're pretty stealthy for a scout. That's I think a little bit better than normal for a scout. And recruits everywhere and very cheap. So you have no excuse for not having excellent recon as the Skaven, and also you've got nice cheap scouts that you can have in large supply to move blood slaves around and move gems around and kind of sneak alongside your armies to support them. You also have the chieftain, who is also very cheap. 35 gold is very cheap for 60 leadership. That's very nice, and recruit anywhere. He is plenty stealthy, so he can lead your stealthy raiding forces, and he is a tier 1 commander in the Warhammer Mod Nation system, so he gets Unsurroundability 1, gets some extra hit points, and he gets an extra little bit of magic resistance. I actually think his hit points might be slightly too high for a Skaven tier 1. Maybe they should be more like 16 or 17, but it's fine. He's a decent fighter, but I wouldn't suggest using him as a thug or anything. You just might, he's a little bit more likely to survive if he actually gets into a fight. He does have Taskmaster 1, which means any slaves that you lead, he will negate one of the well, actually they don't have undisciplined, so they'll just get a flat plus on morale. So if you look at the morale of the slaves, it is 6. He will boost up to 7, which is 2. Oh no, it's only 1 less than your normal clan rats. So he's not bad at leading slaves. Then we have what I would consider to be another cornerstone of the nation at recruitment points 1, the Molder Packmaster. He is recruitable in all forts, and he's also recruitable in any cave provinces that you take, even without a fort. And of course, being only 1 recruitment point, he's perfectly reasonable to recruit him in caves. He's quite a bit more expensive than the Scout and the Chieftain. He's also stealthy. The great thing about Packmasters is that every single turn, they will give you 3 giant rats each. Each turn you get 3 giant rats. We had a brief look at the giant rats, but I'll look again at them after we've talked about the Packmaster. He also spawns in every battle 2d6 plus 2 giant rats. So if you take the average of that of being about 9 rats, he will give you 9 rats in every battle, and he'll also give you 3 on the strategic map each month. So if you get a fair number of Packmasters up, this can be a real feature of the nation. You can end up with the giant rats are good for patrolling. The giant rats can be useful as fodder on the front lines, although they will run away very quickly because they're bad morale. That's basically what Packmasters are for. Because it's better to have the rats that are spawned in battle killed than the ones that are long term, you'll typically put the Packmasters up the front and then tell them to retreat to the back of the formation. So they spawn their rats at the front to run off and fight and die, and your other rats you can put at the back. Although they are undisciplined, so you don't really get to tell them what to do. So giant rats look like this. Here they are. They are not very good at fighting. They're undisciplined, but they are formation fighters. Formation fighter 2 means that 4 giant rats will fit into a square rather than 3 because they're size 2. Because they're undisciplined, they'll be in kind of spread out formations, but they will pack in as they fight. They're not particularly good at fighting at all, really. Their attack is pretty weak. Their length 0, they get hit a lot, they get repelled a lot because they're bad morale. They've got terrible magic resistance, and they're animals, which is generally a bad tag to have. They do have a bunch of survivals, and they had good map moves, so it's pretty easy to move them around. Actually, the biggest drawback I would say with giant rats, apart from just that they're not very good at fighting, and that they'll run away. A thing that's often overlooked about them is that they have Gluttony 1. So they actually eat quite a lot of supplies for a size 2 unit, and if you have large numbers of giant rats, you will definitely want to consider whether you'll end up with your other troops and commanders starving and suffering because of the giant rats being there. So they're not actually that good for massing up to do things like sieges. They can give you extra siege strength. They're perfectly good at that. Terrible for siege defense, really, although given that they're basically free and you'll have lots of them, they're not terrible, I guess, in sieges. They're just individually bad at sieges. They have a little bit of poison resistance, and they have some of the other things Skaven have, including Dark Vision 75, so they can be a bit more useful. Get over there, not very good stats if they're in a cave. So the Packmasters are a very, very useful way of getting those, and in every game I've played this Skaven, I've recruited quite a few Packmasters. It's something where if you don't have that much money, maybe you'll spend a turn just putting 2 of them out of a fort. If you get any cave provinces, you can crank them out all game long. It's just good to have a lot of them running around. I really like to have 2 Packmasters set to patrol with their giant rats in every blood hunting province that I have. Next up is the Warlord. Warlords are your premier, your kind of deluxe military leader. They do take 2 recruitment points, so unlike the chieftains, they're also not recruit anywhere, they're only in forts, so you are giving up, say, a turn of recruiting a mage or recruiting some assassins or something like that to get a warlord, but they are pretty great as leaders. They are 120 leadership, which is excellent. They can lead 4 squads, give +2 morale bonus to each of them, which is very important, and give formations, which is very useful. So I do like to have some warlords available in my armies. Particularly early on, they can make a big difference if you can get one to kind of lead an expansion party. That can be very good for the Skaven's low morale. They're pretty great combatants. They're tier 3, so they've got unsurroundable 3, plenty of hit points, good stats, and magic resistance boosted up to 13. But really, I wouldn't suggest using them as thugs or anything. It's more just that you can use them to do a bit of fighting, and it's kind of thematic to do so. But given their cost of 2 recruitment points from a fort, and the fact that they're giving this morale bonus to all the troops, you really don't want to be losing them. So I would prefer to kind of use them leading from behind in the traditional Skaven style. But they can fight pretty well. They're by no means weak in combat. They can definitely hold their own. They're fairly stealthy, although not particularly stealthy. They've got the usual Skaven traits. They also have Taskmaster 1, just like the Chieftains. They're no better at leading slaves kind of inherently because of that Taskmaster, but if you consider that the Taskmaster is also combined with a +2 morale, you end up with slaves that instead of having 6 morale each, end up with 9 morale, and at that point they're much less likely to run away, so they can be good for leading big blobs of slaves around too, as well as basic clan rats, storm vermin, and so on. Very useful, I would say. And it's just nice that they don't die that often because they're high protection and hit points. Although that can draw enemy spells, it's worth bearing that in mind. Then we have another non-mage commander that I think is a real feature of the nation in the Eshin Assassin. So Eshin Assassins are something that the Skaven are quite famous for. They're very unpleasant, nasty assassins. They are very good assassins. They have a patience rating of 3, which is, very, very strong. They have scale walls, so they can actually enter and exit castles. They can also do assassinations inside. So if you besiege a castle, or if the enemy is kind of hiding mages in a castle, the Eshin Assassin can climb over the walls and attack kind of during the night. They can sneak in, they can get in through sewage pipes, they climb over the roofs, all this kind of stuff. This is what they're experts at doing, infiltrating places. They are also, because of their expertise in infiltration and the like, they are spies. So they will give you more information. They can get enemy score graphs by infiltrating capitals. They can also cause unrest by using the instill uprising command, although it's worth bearing in mind the enemy will get a message notifying them about that. It can be kind of good to do that if you do that across lots of their provinces, having said, hey look, I will unleash all these assassins upon you if you, for instance, go to war with me or stop contesting me for this throne or something like that, and you can just hit a quick round of instill uprisings all over their territory to show them you've covered them with assassins. So that can be quite a nice trick to do. In combat, they're pretty monstrous. They're tier 2, they're unsurroundable 2, so they actually can survive fighting a few bodyguards or like skeletons, things like that. It's possible. They've got pretty amazing stats. They hit pretty hard. They've got magical weapons, 2 of them, the Weeping Blades. Each of these, if it does hit and do damage, has strong poison attached to it, which is usually enough to kill any human-sized enemy. So even if you just nick them through their armor, it's usually enough to kill them. So very good at killing mages in melee. They're pretty fast, although not super fast. It would be great for them to be a bit faster, really. So overall a very strong assassin, but here's the crucial thing. They're only a single recruitment point each. Now, I think this is something I might change in the future because assassin can prove to be just so good, particularly because the Eshin Assassin, like often I will remove the slots from an assassin because I think an assassin given certain items can just be too obnoxious in Dominions. Like if you give them a water bottle, you can see in the Skaven game I'm doing at the moment, I've been giving them lifelong protections, water bottles, Amulet of the Dead so they can summon skeletons. There's a lot you can do to make them very obnoxious and hard to defend against, particularly given they've got scale walls. So I think in the future I will probably be boosting this up to 2 recruitment points. I think they'll still be worth recruiting at 2 recruitment points, still be worth getting a few of them, but you won't be able to just go, oh hell, this turn I'll have my 5 forts, pump out 10 assassins and suddenly have this big fleet of assassins you can charge around with. They've also got great movement, much like the Gutter Runners. They've got good map move and they've got swimming and various survivals. Their stealth is also extremely good. So a real feature of the nation. Definitely use these. I wouldn't really suggest trying to do an assassin expansion or anything with them. They still can die quite easily in against just like a mounted commander or something like that. Can sometimes beat them in combat, but yeah, very strong. One of the strongest assassins, certainly. I think stronger than most vanilla assassins, especially that aren't mages. And by vanilla, I of course mean unmodded Dominions 5. Now we are on to the mages, and we have the basic mage. This is your lowest tier mage, the Pestilence Plague Chantor. He is a holy one. He's sacred. He is one of the Pestilence clan, so he's got the higher poison resistance, and also goes berserk, which is maybe not what you want in your mage in the middle of a battle. He's not particularly great at fighting or anything. He's got a little bit more hit points than usual because he's got the Pestilence kind of plague monk toughness. Really, what he gives you is a single point of magic, and that is in death or blood. 100% death blood, and then 13 rather than 10% random, because 13 is the Skaven's favourite number. Unlucky for your enemies, lucky for you, is also death and blood. So you can get a blood 2, it's possible. You can get a death 2, that's possible, but it's not that exciting. But yeah, having basically some of them are D1, some of them are blood 1. That's basically what you end up with. The Death 1 ones you can use for maybe casting Dark Knowledge. Other than that, maybe forging Amulet of the Dead for your assassins, things like that. Basically, though, you'll be using those as a cheap research mage, and you might want to do that if you've got magic scales. If you have magic scales, particularly if you've got Magic 3, then this is one of the most cost-effective researches in the game. It might even be a reason for you to take Magic 3 scales, because if you look at their kind of 3-year forecast of research points to gold cost, I believe under Magic 3 it works out as 2.2 research per gold cost over 3 years. And if you don't have Magic 3, if you're just at neutral scales, then it is 1.5 research points per gold over 3 years. So yeah, a very good researcher, and you can, the death ones are not really useful very much at all other than researching, although they're a good place to stick your research boosters when you forge them, which you definitely will be doing with this nation. And the blood ones, of course, you can have them go off and blood hunt. They can forge a sanguine dowsing rod and they can go off and blood hunt, and they're very economical at that too. So this is a real nice little economical workhorse of the nation. Possibly it could be a little bit more expensive, but I think it's not too aggressively priced at the moment. So I'll keep an eye on it, and possibly it maybe should be a little bit more expensive. Moving on to your next low tier mage, we've got the Scryer Warlock. So the Scryer Warlock is significantly better at research, but in terms of gold efficiency, because he's not sacred and because he costs more, almost twice as much, he is quite a bit lower. I think if you've got magic scales, I would still use the warlocks for research generally over the plague chantors, and that's because they are actually useful mages. Plague chantors, the blood 1 ones are very nice for going off, and you can also do summon imps and things like that with them and union them up with sabbaths. But the Scryer Warlock comes with very nice paths. He's got a 100% random in fire, death, and earth, and then he's got a 13% in the same, which means you will relatively often get fire 2, earth 1, and earth 2, fire 1. You will also get fire, earth, death, and there's a few things as the Skaven you can do with that crosspath. You can do a bit of site searching and so on with them, or you can just use them for research. So this is another kind of workhorse mage. He also comes with a bit more siege bonus because he's got a little bit of engineering knowledge. It's not massively important, but it can be useful if you've got a stack that's supported. You're trying to take a castle and you've got a bunch of warlocks there present as well. It can be nice to have that siege bonus. Of course, he's stealthy, etc. He's got a little bit of shock resistance, which can be quite nice sometimes if he gets hit by a bit of stray lightning. Yeah, a real useful workhorse mage. Of course, lots of things you can cast with F2 or E2. You could, in theory, get an Earth 3-1, but it's extremely unlikely, or a Fire 3-1. But yeah, not very likely. Then we have the only Molder mage, which is the Molder Mutator. The Molder Mutator, he's a pretty tough character, and he's actually a bit more of a military commander in a way. So he is counted as a tier 2 military commander, so he's got Unsurroundable 2. He's got pretty decent stats and hit points and things. He's got quite a nice weapon in the form of the Creature Killer, which is armor piercing built in, so it can hit surprisingly hard. 20 armor piercing damage is very nasty. And then it's also got, if it does damage, cut down to size, which is 4 armor piercing damage, but it's ×3 against larger beings, so 12 armor piercing against things that are larger than him. 4 armor piercing is not very relevant, but can be nice against things that are bigger than him. They are also Beastmasters. Oh, I forgot to say, these are Beastmaster 4 and have Animal Law 3, so very good against animals. You could potentially thug against animals, although I'm not sure why you would want to. But Beastmaster 4 means that they can be excellent leading around big packs of giant rats, giving them much more morale and making them more reliable in combat. You can take them over from the Packmasters and lead them around with your mutators. The Packmasters, I forgot to mention, have Beastmaster 2, so they add 2 morale to the rats. But of course, rats have very poor morale indeed, starting morale of 7, and they're undisciplined, so it's actually 6. They'll end up on 8 under a Packmaster, although maybe Packmasters are... Yeah, they also give -1 morale, so they're only 7 under a Packmaster, whereas under a Mutator, they still get the -1 because he's a bad leader or anything that isn't rats, but they will end up with an extra 2, so they'll end up at 9 morale under a Mutator. The crucial thing about the Mutator really, though, is that he's got Earth 1, Blood 1, which is useful for a couple of national spells, which I'll get to a bit later, but also he has Blood Searcher 1, so he searches as a Blood 2. If you put a Sanguine Dowsing Rod on him, he searches as a Blood 3, which is a very efficient searcher. So Molder Mutators are a good, if somewhat expensive way of quickly getting a blood economy going. In the longer term, you'd rather have your Blood 1 Chantors with the Sanguine Dowsing Rods, because they'll end up cheaper in terms of upkeep and so on. But to get it started, the Molder Mutator is better, because you can set straight away as a Blood 2. And these paths can be quite useful. Because you've got Blood on Earth, you can also potentially end up going down the Earth Blood cross path booster that gives you Earth Gems and an Earth boost, which can be very nice. You do have to do some clever stuff boosting them up in order to get them high enough in Blood and Earth to do that, but you can do it. So it's an option for you. Now we're moving on to kind of our main battle mages, which is these two, the Plague Priest and the Warlock Engineer. Pestilence Plague Priest can do a lot of things. This really is, and I use the term workhorse mage, I think I overuse it a little bit, but this really is a workhorse mage, and I will tell you why. They can lead around a decent sized squad. They're 40 leader, so it's not as good as a chieftain, but they can be useful for leading things. They can bless things, of course. They are stealthy. They are pretty dang tough, and they count as military tier 2 leaders. They have Unsurroundable 2, they have the better magic resistance, and they have good hit points. Their stats are fine. They've got decent weapons. They've actually got 3 attacks. So if you get them into combat, if you can get them to the point where they're have got maybe some items, or if you put, I think you can get invulnerability through using death magic as a self buff. Potentially you could get Soul Vortex or something like that going. There's a few things you can do with them. They do have a Plague Scepter that can do Incense Clouds, which is like a bit like having a budget version of the Snake Bladder stick. It's very similar to the Censors. They can lead groups of Censors. They can lead groups of Council Guard and bless them. They can cast Sermon of Courage, which can be very useful for your low morale troops. They have guaranteed Death 2, and of course Death 2 is a very strong path. You can use it for the purposes of doing Horde of Skeletons. You can do with gems, you can do Shadow Blasts, there's an all number of spells you can do with Death 2. It's also got a lot of ritual spells that are useful. They have the hand slot such that if you make a Skull Staff, they can get to Death 3. They also have Blood Magic level 1, so you've got Death Blood as a cross path here. You would need to boost this significantly, but if you do boost it significantly, you can get up towards doing things like getting vampires through Death Blood, which is obviously very nice in standard dominions. So you get all of this. You also get that 13% random, so they're no less likely to get to Blood 2 than the Plague Chantors, but no more likely either. Oh no, they are actually more likely, yes, because they've got the Blood built-in one. So you can get Blood 2 ones sometimes, which is nice. You can get Death 3 ones sometimes, which is nice, but you probably actually will be building quite a few Plague Priests, kind of depending on what your Bless is like and what your Magical Drain scale is like. If you are looking at them as researchers, I would say no, go with Chantors and Warlocks instead. They're not as good for the purposes of research in terms of gold cost, but they are good battle mages, and if you have the right paths, you know what you can do with a death magic level 2. You can also Sabbath them up to get higher death. That's potentially something you might want to do to cast things like Rigor Mortis. So a lot you can do with the Pestilence Plague Priest. He's not very expensive really for all the stuff he can do. A real workhorse mage. One thing to be aware of with him, aside from the vulnerability of having no protection built in, is that he is a berserker. So sometimes in a battle, if somebody set off Foul Vapors is doing him some damage, through his very respectable 7 poison resistance, that might set off his berserk. Firestorm and Earthquake, something like that. That's really something to look out for, because you might want these guys doing skilly spam or something like that, but instead they're running off to try and hit things because they've gone berserk. So that's some of their vulnerabilities. But another good thing about them I should mention is that because they're Holy 2, they can blood sacrifice. The Skaven are a nation that can do blood sacrifice. And doing 2 blood slaves a turn for 190 gold sacred unit, the upkeep on that, doing 2 slaves a turn, I think is often worth it to push your Dominion a bit, strengthen it up. Dominion spread is, I think, a little bit more important for the Skaven than it might be for other nations, because being in friendly Dominion is more important for the morale bonus that you might need. Sorry, for the morale bonus that you might need on your various troops, particularly on your chaff. So that's nice to have. Yeah, all around a very strong unit. It also has very nice disease resistance. This is improved over the normal Skaven disease resistance. So if we look at, say, the Molder Mutator, it's 25. The Chantor, I believe, is 50. Yes, 50% disease resistance, and the Plague Priest is 75. So if you do happen to get a fort and lab like I did in a game that's on a site that causes disease, basically I exclusively recruit Pestilence Plague Priest from there just to avoid getting a mage and then they're immediately diseased. They're much less likely for that to happen. Now we have the premier battle mage of the nation, which is the Warlock Engineer. These guys can also do a lot. They're quite a bit more expensive because they're not sacred, so they have double the upkeep of the Plague Priest, and they cost an additional 20 gold as well. They also cost a fair few extra resources, which sometimes is relevant, although you should have enough resources to be able to doing these without, recruiting these mages without worrying about it too much. What the Warlock Engineer gives you is the biggest concentration of research in one place. And if you've got magic scales, obviously these are the most, in terms of cost, because they're not sacred over like 3 years, they are by no means the most efficient. I think they're only the Molten Mutator is less efficient, or your cap only, slow to recruit mage is less efficient in terms of research. But if you're taking Drain, they become significantly more efficient because, of course, Drain matters more when it's on affecting lots of low research point mages, and they do have 16 built in, which is quite a bit. So if you've decided to take Drain, which I did in the game, for example, then the Warlock Engineer is not a bad thing to recruit for research. It's still not the most gold efficient, but it's less bad than if you were in Magic. If you're in Magic, probably not be using these for research too much. But the nice thing about the Warlock Engineer is that it is a very good mage. It has very nice paths, Fire 1, Earth 1 guaranteed, and then randoms of Fire, Earth, Death 100%, and that's twice, and then the 13% random. So you can get Warlock Engineers who have Death 2. Doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. You can get up to Fire 3, you can get up to Earth 3. You can get cross paths of Fire 2, Earth 2, which is important for some national spells and various things you can forge. Regarding forging, it's also worth noting that they come with a forge bonus. It's not as good as Ulm's forge bonus. It's not, 2 gem discount from everything they build, but it is 1 gem. And that means that a Warlock Engineer with a hammer can forge 5 gem items, the trinkets of the Dominions 5 world, but only 2 gems apiece. And you'd be surprised how much having a forge bonus of 1 will change the way that you think about the things that you're forging and how you're using them. It really will save you quite a lot of gems over the course of the game. Recruiting quite a few Warlock Engineers is very good because they're good battle mages, they're good ritual mages, you can do a lot with them, but also just because having them with a variety of paths gives you the forging options to keep getting that discount in. You'll definitely want to be getting Dwarven Hammers going with them so that you can forge things with them. So you'll have multiple Warlock Engineers with hammers forging things quite often during Skaven games. Of course, like the Skaven, they've got all these standard abilities, and like the Warlocks, they've got shock resistance, but their shock resistance is much higher. 10 is enough that, especially given that you've got the Earth to increase your shock resistance even more, you can be safe from certain lightning things. It can really help you quite a lot against Wrathful Skies to keep these guys going. It can help you quite a bit against just random lightning things, shock weapons, stuff like that. Yeah, it's pretty nice having 10 poison resistance. They've got a little bit of, 10 shock resistance. A little bit of poison resistance. Crucially, the other thing about them is that they have 10 siege bonus. It's not a whopping great siege bonus that you get off a dedicated sieger or mage engineers, things like that. On Arcos Kefale and Ulm have some sieging commanders. But 10, let's say you've got 5 Warlock Engineers that your main mages you're taking with a big stack of troops. That gives you 50 extra siege bonus every time you're sieging, so they can significantly help you take down castles. And you're already very good at that, so this really does get to the point where you're doing 1 or 2 turn pops with your decent armies with the Skaven, and of course you can sneak them in, take a fort, and then very quickly pop it, which is very, very exciting as an option. Yeah, pretty aggressively costed and good mage, but that does start to eat your gold quite a bit, so maybe not the premier choice for research mages. Finally, we have our only slow to recruit mage, and they are cap only, and that's the Grey Seer. The Grey Seer comes with a couple of extra things that are special about it. So the first is that it's a priest level 3, holy 3, so it can sacrifice 3 blood slaves a turn. That's not quite so economical, but if you don't have that many temples up, then this could be worth doing. I often will have one doing it in my capital, so 3 blood slaves a turn is very nice for pushing your dominion out. It also comes with Fortune Teller 13. 13 again, the lucky number for the Skavens, but Fortune Teller prevents some bad events from happening, and it sometimes tells you that some global events are coming up, which can be very nice. So having at least 1 or 2 Grey Seers in your capital throughout most of the game, I would say, is a pretty good idea to avoid very nasty events landing on your cap. It does. I have seen them prevent events, relatively often. It can be a nice bonus. It's not something you really want to rely on, but it's pretty nice as a bonus. Now, you're not going to be wanting to recruit these as researchers. You may wish to recruit them for their purpose as moving around and being priest level 3s to go and take thrones. That really gives you a lot of extra ability to go and snatch thrones, particularly because you are a fantastic sieging nation and you have lots of things that are stealthy and you have pretty good survivals and map movement. The main thing you're going to use Grey Seers for, though, apart from snatching thrones up, is to get access to Astral and to get access to Death 3. They have a 100% fire astral death, and then the usual 13% extra chance of getting that same random. And yeah, so you can get Death 3 with them relatively often. You can get Astral 3 with them relatively often. The one you don't really want to see is Fire 2, Astral 2, Death 2, but there is still quite a bit you can do with that. You can cast Astral Fires, and you can do things like that. Using those paths, you can of course boost them up in the standard ways, and they can be nice to move around and do a bit of site searching. But yeah, getting access to Astral is of course fantastic. You can use these guys as communion masters of lots of Sabbath slaves, like your Chantors, things like that, to pump up these paths. Yeah, they just generally can be very useful. If you've got reinvigoration on your Bless, then these guys can be good alongside Plague Priests to just put out tons and tons of skeletons and things like that and cast spells that are quite fatiguing and then just wake up because they've got the reinvigoration. Just a very strong mage, generally speaking, and benefits a lot from the fact that he is very stealthy. So a nice cap anyone. Wouldn't suggest getting that many of them early on because you're going to be wanting your cap to get one of your other excellent mages every single turn. And he's going to take 2 turns, of course, of cap output. Now that we've discussed the recruitable commanders, let's have a quick look at the multi-heroes and the heroes. So as usual, I've got preview sites that show these. There's the luck-based multi-heroes. These are just the Grey Seer, and that's affected by your luck scales. So you're twice as likely if you've got luck 3. Oh, sorry. If you have to misfortune 3, you will never get any multi-heroes because you go from 3% chance each turn to 0% chance each turn. And if you've got luck 3, you're twice as likely. I believe you get 6% chance each turn of a multi-hero turning up instead of 3%. Getting a Grey Seer as multi-hero is nice because it's a capital-only, slow-to-recruit mage. Yeah, not much more to say about that. It's nice. I don't think it's a reason to take luck scales exactly, and maybe you would want to take misfortune scales with Skaven. We'll talk about that later. Then we've got the luck independent heroes. These are not affected by the luck or misfortune scale. They're just a percentage chance each turn, each of them of turning up, and in your capital that is. And some of them are limited. They can't turn up, very early in the game. Some of them will turn up with troops, and some of them won't, depending on how strong they are, and some of them are a little bit more likely to turn up than others. Starting from the top, we have the Grand Chieftain. This is Tretch Craventail. He is immortal. He comes with a built-in Lucky Skullhelm. The Lucky Skullhelm gives him luck and a bit of invulnerability, and is generally a good helmet. If he is killed and is resurrected via immortality, I believe he loses this, although in a future version I might try to fix that so that if he doesn't have the lucky Skullhelm, he picks it back up and event gives it to him. So I'm going to take a look at that. But basically, Tretch is he's special only really in the sense that he is immortal and lucky. So he's very hard to get rid of permanently. Having like unrestricted immortality, it's set to 6 months, so it takes 6 months before he will respawn after being killed, but it's still nice to have. Other than that, he's basically just like a warlord. He's got the same amount of leadership as a warlord. His fighting stats are not particularly amazing or anything. I think they're around the same level as a warlord. But having built-in invulnerability is nice, and being immortal is nice. So he's one of the least impressive ones. He does turn up with a bunch of clan rats, I believe, and maybe some storm vermin. I can't remember exactly, but he turns up with some troops to use in battle straight away. Then we have the Greater Packmaster, Squeal Gnawtooth. Squeal's quite cool because he's not really a combat lord exactly. Instead, he's a lord that turns up with a ton of giant rats that come with him. He spawns a bunch of giant rats in combat every time. He's like, if you think about the Packmaster, I think they get 2d6 plus 2. He gets 5d6 plus 5 at the start of every battle. So every battle he's in, you get this big wave of rats released from him, basically. But then also, in addition to coming with a whole load of rats when he first arrives and joins your army, he also summons 8 per month. So that is the equivalent of nearly 3 Packmasters on his own, and can make quite a big difference. If you get him, you can be outputting a lot more rats than you otherwise would, particularly if you keep using him in battles and using all these free rats that come with him. He does have Animal Ore 4, which is good if you actually are running into any animals or anything. Other than that, he's not a particularly powerful commander. He comes with his own magic weapon, the Warp Lash, that you can use, which is okay for repelling because it's got, high attack and it's length 4. He doesn't have any other particularly great things about him, except for the fact that he's got 3 misc slots, which can be quite nice. You can do a little bit with that. So having 3 misc slots is pretty nice. But his hit points and so on, and his basic stats aren't particularly amazing. So you will also, if you're risking him in combat, you're risking the fact that you'll lose all of these free rats you're getting. So I would say just use him as a rat generator, send him along with your armies. He does have one very nice thing here, which is that he's got Beastmaster +6. So any animals that you put under his control, which is mostly rats, of course, they're going to get a big boost to their morale. So he's very useful for just keeping the rats in the battle too. Then we have another leader from the Molder clan, the ones that make all the mutated animals, which is the Master Mutator, Throt the Unclean. He is much more of a combat beast than Squeal. You can see his stats in general are much better. He's got higher strength, higher hit points. He's actually got 3 arms because he's mutated himself, and consequently he carries a creature killer weapon, a Dominator Whip, and a Falchion. So a nice combination of weapons there built in. 3 attacks, one of them is magic. The creature killer has the extra effect like the Molder Master Mutators. They carry... they're not called Master Mutators, are they? Hold on a moment. What are they called? Just Mutators. They are Molder Mutators. He is the Master Mutator. Yeah, so he's kind of the top level guy, or very high level powerful hero from Molder. He comes with Earth 2 and Blood 2, which is very useful because the Molder Mutators only have Earth 1, Blood 1, which means they're more difficult to boost up to make things like the Earth Bloodstone, the Earth booster that you can get with Blood on Earth cross paths. He also comes with some nice built-in abilities. He's got regeneration of 20%, so that's double what you would normally have. Normal is 10%. And if you stack this with other kinds of regeneration, which you easily can because he's got 3 misc slots, he can be very tough indeed. He comes with quite a bit of natural protection. 5's not too bad. If you put some magic armor on him, he's pretty tough. His stats, for fighting, not terrible at all. Yeah, he can be thugged out, where he can use this regeneration to his advantage. Earth is a good path, of course, for thugging. He can self-buff himself. But another thing that he does is gives you 1 Rat Ogre each month for free, which is nice. He's also good at casting the the national spells. We'll have a look at those later. But the Molder national spells are in Earth and Blood, so you can cast those. Yeah, 1 Rat Ogre per month is nice to have. He can lead around his armies. He's got Beastmaster 4, so he also can be used to lead lots of rats into battle. He's not as good as it as Squeal, but he's still pretty good. He comes with Blood Searcher 1, so he effectively searches for blood as a Blood 3, but I wouldn't really recommend using him for blood searching. What I would do with Throt is pretty much try and keep him in low risk situations so you keep getting that 1 Rat Ogre per month, because that's pretty useful. Do some kind of light thugging with him. He can reliably keep himself alive. He's got good attack output and everything, so just get kind of armor and things to give him more survivability, and have him take part in battles alongside armies. Don't send him off on his own doing it, where he can use his rat ogres and he can lead groups of rats and things like that. Yeah, just generally useful. None of these so far are like a very transformative for your nation or anything. Probably the most transformative is getting Squeal relatively early on because they just have tons of rats you can use. But if you just build a load of Packmasters, you can get more rats than Squeal could ever give you. This next one is a really powerful hero and is actually pretty transformative. And this is your Chief Warlock Engineer, the genius of Clan Scryer, Ikit Claw. Very long description. Ikit Claw has this fantastic array of rainbow paths. So he gives you, if you don't already have it, access to water and air. He doesn't give you access to any other paths that you can't otherwise get, but he does come with 3 earth and 3 fire, and he gives you access to cross paths that you don't otherwise have. But yeah, having astral and death, so these are the paths that you basically will get with Grey Seers and Engineers. Fire, earth, astral, and death. Doesn't have any blood, but getting the extra 1 water and 1 air is nice for cross paths and getting access to that if you haven't otherwise. He also comes with nice elemental resistances and pretty good stats. You know, he can keep himself alive. I wouldn't suggest using him as a thug again necessarily, even though he comes with a bit of reinvigoration, because you will be risking this lovely rainbow. Basically, you want to be making the most of all this diversity gives you purposes of forging and things. He's not interested in forging things cheaply, and so he doesn't have the forge discount that the warlords have. He's a pretty great researcher, you know, you get a big chunk of research from him. But again, because it's a national hero and he's got all this, you know, diversity, you don't really want to be using it for that. It's basically just exciting to get this kind of diversity. There's a load of different spells you can cast. There's lots of things you can forge and so on. Yeah, it's very nice. He can also set himself up as the head of a communion, and then he's got access to all these different paths being boosted up by, you know, Sabbath slaves, or possibly you could use Grey Slayers as communion slaves. I wouldn't really recommend it, but certainly you can use Plague Chanters and Plague Priests as Sabbath slaves to boost him up. So he can be very good as a combat mage. Anything else to mention about him? Well, he comes with 3 misc slots, which is often exciting because you can do quite a few different things with 3 misc slots. I think I don't really know if this is still true. I think this was true in a previous version of Dominions, but I haven't tested it. There's a thing where if you have a misc slot item here and here, you know, separated from each other by another one, you can double up on the effects of them. But I don't think that that's the case anymore. But certainly 3 misc slots allows you to equip 3 kind of misc boosters that you might not otherwise be able to do. So a very strong one there, and not one that you'll be allowed to get very early. He's prevented from turning up very early. Then we have another very strong mage, the Chosen Grey Seer. So he's kind of a souped up Grey Seer. This is Thanquol. And Thanquol actually turns up with a Rat Ogre bodyguard. So it's a unique troop, Bone Ripper. I think I haven't put Bone Ripper on here. No, I can. What I will do after I finish talking about the heroes is go and add Bone Ripper so that he turns up here. But Bone Ripper, or maybe I'll put him on the summons bit. Yeah, I'll put him here and I'll put a note about that. But basically, Bone Ripper is a one-off troop that just accompanies Thanquol. And I don't think I've implemented it yet, but I was planning to put an event so that if Bone Ripper does die, he can get a replacement Bone Ripper, because he's quite famous for having his bodyguards die off and then having to replace them. But Bone Ripper is a big, nasty rat ogre that I'll show you in a little bit. So Thanquol is a souped up Grey Seer, so he comes with the typical Grey Seer stuff. He's got Death and Astral. He starts off as Astral 4, which is very nice. He can use 2 Astral boosters. You know, he can use the Starshine Skullcap and he can use the Crystal Coin. So he can boost up his Astral. The fact that he doesn't have his hand slots doesn't matter in the way that it does for a Death Mage, because they want to be able to get the Skull stuff. He comes with built-in 15% regeneration, which is very nice. He's sacred, of course. He comes with built-in damage reversal 12 versus magic resistance, which is very strong indeed. That's damage reversal, not if you take damage, you also do equal damage to them. It's if they don't pass their magic resistance tests against 12, the damage done to you is completely reflected onto them. You don't take any of it and they do, so that's very strong. And it means that you could use him for some kind of thugging, things like that. But I think he's kind of too valuable to risk in that sense. He also comes with a very strong fortune teller ability, which is, you know, like the Grey Seers, can prevent events and enable you to see upcoming global events, things like that. But really the great utility of him is that he's just got great magic. So yeah, fantastic magic. Comes with some nice things that will keep him alive. You may want to give him some other items just to kind of keep him alive. But yeah, very strong. Enables you to get up to Astral 6 without a great deal of difficulty, although the Skaven natively can't forge the crystal coin, so you might have to trade for one of those, or, you know, find some other way of getting that, because that's Earth and Astral to make the crystal coin. But you can certainly get to 5 very easily by just forging his own Starshine Skullcap and putting that on. And 5 Astral gets you quite a bit. And then, of course, he can lead communions and so on. So that's the Star of the Grey Seers, that's one side of the Skaven religion, and now we have the Star of the Plague Priests, and this is the Plague Lord Skrulk. Skrulk is much more of a combat beast than Thanquol, and I kind of would recommend doing a bit of thugging with him, because his paths are not that important for your purposes. They don't really give you any diversity. It's nice to have another Holy 3, but of course you already have Holy 3s. He comes with Death 3, but he can't boost it up to Death 4 by the normal means because he doesn't have hand slots to carry the skull stuff. So you would have to get one of the much higher, more expensive death boosters on him, like Skull Face or something like that in the head slot. so it's harder to boost that up. He can carry 2 of the blood boosters to get himself up to blood 4, but he can't get up to blood 5, I think, because he would have to have Armor of Souls and Brazen Skull, but then he doesn't have the hand slots to carry the Anathema or Anathame. I can't remember how it's. I think it's Anathema, the dagger that gives you a boost to blood magic, but he can get to blood 4. Basically, these are nice to have. It's nice to have the Holy Three, but I think to get the most out of him, you kind of have to have him being like a thug alongside an army. So you can kit him out with some equipment. You can use the fact that he's natively got some useful abilities for thugging, like he's got built-in pretty good fear. He's got a built-in fairly nasty magic weapon, the Rod of Corruption, which is basically a flail, so it's got 2 attacks, but then it also does an incense cloud, which is the same one on the Censer Bearers, the sacred troops you can recruit. But then it also has the ability of blasting people with this corruption attack, which is a load of armor negating damage, but magic resistance does negate it. So he can kind of kill individual targets free with large amounts of poison and spray poison gases all over the place. He also comes with a poison cloud, which can kill things around him, and he comes with poison barbs, which if they're trying to hit him, means he can hit them back with that. He is blind but has Spirit Sight, so Spirit Sight can be useful to deal with invisible enemies and things like that. He's got, the kind of good combat stats and built-in unsurroundability that can make him useful as a thug. And he's also inspirational, so he can be an okay army leader. So I would just say put him at the head of a kind of pestilence-themed army, make the most of his paths where you can, and you can do like a soul vortex or something like that to thug with him. But yeah, equip him up and thug him. He's less of a like impact as a caster than the other 2 heroes, but still pretty good caster. Then we have the star of Clan Eshin, which is Snikch, the Death Master. Snikch is a super assassin. He doesn't have very many slots because he's already got all this built-in magical equipment, but he can take, the misc items that make assassins very strong. But he is in fact a bit of a combat monster already. He has exceptional stats. He's got this massive defense skill because it starts off huge because of his dodging and skill and general just like insanely supernaturally good ability in combat. And then he also has all of these modifiers from having the Cloak of Shadows, which kind of acts like a shield, and having these 3 whipping blades because he can hold one in his tail. He also comes with a throwing weapon, although I would not recommend sending him to assassinations and just throwing a shuriken at people. I would instead just go straight in for the attack. You can put a couple of extra items on him to make him even better when he's charging in on the attack. But basically, send him in as a super assassin, he can annihilate stuff. He's also a spy, but the main thing is that he's an assassin with crazy amounts of patience, so he basically will ignore bodyguards a lot of the time. He has wall scaling, so he can assassinate things inside forts. Yeah, just terrifying. I wouldn't really use him for thugging exactly. I mean, he is ethereal, but you can't get his protection up that high. You could put Boots of Stone on him, I guess, or Iron Face, I believe it's called, to get his protection up, but you can't just put an armor slot on him because he's got this shadow cloak that makes him ethereal. But yeah, just kind of a super assassin and just really fun. And I also really like the graphic. It's one I did quite a while ago, I think, but it just looks really nice. Finally, we have the Warlord of Moors. So he's not from any of the special clans, he's just from one of the big Warlord clans, but he is an absolute beast of a Skaven in combat. And this is Queek Headtaker, famously arrogant and you would say privileged Skaven, although he's gotten there through hard work and killing lots of people sent to assassinate him. He's basically like an amped up Warlord. He's got Unsurroundability 4 because he's a tier 4 combat monster. He has got built-in very nice protection because he's got Warpstone armor built into him. You could give him a better helmet, is how it's not that great. He's got 2 very nasty, powerful magic weapons. One of them is armor piercing and does a lot of damage. 21 magic armor piercing damage, very tasty. And then the Dwarf Slayer has just got good stats, basically. The Dwarf Slayer, I believe, is the sword, and the Gouger is the pick that he fights with. He is got a built-in Banefire shield. It's not very strong at 5 AP damage, but it will decay things, and just having a shield built in of any kind like that is very nice. Yeah, chuck a few items on him and send him off as a thug. He's also a good army leader because he's got the same leadership as a warlord. He's not super exciting. I would just say, yeah, use him as an army leader, and he also thugs in whatever army he's in and beats some stuff up. You can also send him off to arenas and things because he's famously overconfident. So yeah, one of my favourite characters from Warhammer, and a kind of just a fun, basic combat hero. that's all the heroes, and I think what I'll do is I'll go and make a change to this so that I can show you Bone Ripper in the other summon sites just for the purposes of completeness, and then we will move on to talking about national spells, pretender selection scales, and the Warpstone seam mechanic. I said I'd show you the Rat Ogre Bodyguard, so I've gone away and added him in so that he'll appear. Bone Ripper will appear in the Skaven summons and other preview sites. So here he is. You get Bone Ripper, a very nice kind of almost Super Nintendo style graphic that I did for him, quite overemphasized muscles and things, but he's a 3-armed Rat Ogre Bodyguard. He has a nice extra boost to his bodyguard abilities. He's got pretty nice combat stats. He's very tough. But yeah, it's more of a flavor thing really that he's there guarding Thanquol. And yeah, this is Bone Ripper. If he dies, you won't get another one, but maybe in the future I might add an event so that you do get him back, or get a different version of him maybe. Famously, there's been many different Bone Rippers. I think this is technically Bone Ripper the Third that he's on now. Yeah, but he'll get that Rat Ogre Bodyguard comes with him as a troop. I also, since I was going away and doing that, I went and changed Tretch. I basically made an event so that if Tretch ever is killed, the Grand Chieftain, he's immortal and he would end up losing his iconic Lucky Skull Helm, but I put an event so if he comes back and he doesn't have the Skull Helm, the game will then give him the Skull Helm. So yeah, there's an event to give him his Skull Helm back. I also, since I was going away and changing things for the next version of the mod, I decided to go ahead and make the Eshin Assassin cost 2 command points. Sure why that's not showing up here, but yeah, believe me, this will cost 2 command points in the next version, or whatever version you'll be using when you watch this video. It will cost 2 command points because otherwise they're just too massable, basically. So that's the heroes and a minor change that I've made there to the Eshin Assassin. Next thing to do is to talk about some of the national spells, and I'll have to go into the game to show you those, but I will do that. So it'll be national spells, and then we'll look at the pretender selection, and then the special mechanic that the Skaven get, the Warpstone seams. There's not a lot to explain there, but I will go through that. And then finally, just some suggestions for what you might want for your pick for your scales and things. Let's have a look at the Skaven national spells. Starting off in Conjuration. At level 4, you get Vermintide. Vermintide takes 2 death and 1 holy, so you'll be casting it mostly with your Plague Priests, although you could, in theory, cast it with a Plague Chantor who got a death random, got D2. It's very unlikely to get those, but you could get some. You could also cast it with your Grey Seers, but you can't cast it with your Warlocks and so on because they don't have the holy level. Vermintide summons up 5+ Raised Vermin. It's a very similar spell to Horde of Skeletons, things like that. The Crazed Vermin have some advantages over skeletons, and then they have some disadvantages as well, so it's really worth having a look at those to talk about them. But it's nice that it's plus number of effect, so if you have higher death levels, which some Plague Priests will, and you can of course give them boosters and so on, and if you've got a Grey Seer who's got very high death and a booster, you can get more out of that, which is quite nice. The fatigue cost isn't terribly high. Yeah, it really is comparable with Grey Skeletons and Horde of Skeletons. I would say Horde of Skeletons in a lot of situations is better. But let's have a look at the creature that you get when you use Vermintide. As with the other summons, they appear in this preview site, so that you can see them from the national overview. Here's the preview site. It's the Crazed Vermin. So Crazed Vermin are size 1, and that can be nice because you can get 6 of them into a square. It can also be a problem if you're trying to fill a wide frontage because, again, you get 6 of them into a square, so you end up with them covering not as much ground as like Horde of Skeletons and Raised Dead and things like that. So that can be a bit of a problem. They are mindless and a little bit poison resistant, but they don't have all of the immunities and things that undead do. They don't have the disadvantage of being undead, though. They won't get hit by banishment, things like that. So if the opponent has brought lots of banishment and things to deal with you using Skelly spam, then you could switch to doing Crazed Vermin as a sudden kind of switch over trick to avoid all their banishment and their priest stuff that they're using. And there's various other spells that would be very good against hordes of undead, which will not work against Crazed Vermin. They have Formation Fighter 1, but this is a bit of a joke because you can always fit 6 things into one square if they're size 1. They don't need Formation Fighter, and it doesn't let them fit any extra things into the square. So functionally, this doesn't do anything. They're undisciplined. They'll just run off from the caster and go and fight things. They have, because they're mindless, they're not going to rout or anything, but they will dissolve if they don't have leadership. But they are not undead and they're not magic, so they don't need a particular type of leadership to keep them in the battle. They're very fast, so they can run into battle very quickly, even if you're casting them kind of right from the back, which can be quite useful. And in terms of their combat stats, not very strong. They don't hit very hard at all, significantly less hard than skeletons and things like that. They have worse attack and defense skill than skeletons. And they have worse hit points than skeletons. They also don't have the pierce resistance. So why was I saying that they are potentially better than skeletons? Well, they don't have the undead weaknesses, and the other thing about them, other than just that they can pack a lot of them into a square so they can pull things down with their bites, is that their attack is actually armor piercing. Even though it's very low damage against certain enemies who have very high armor, this is actually better than having the higher damage from the skeletons, weapons, and so on. So yeah, these can be quite good for pulling down things that have high protection but not a huge amount of hit points. Like if they were up against Ulmish troops, I think they would behave better than skeletons and raised dead and so on. But they're not really a replacement; they're just an alternative. I think the main attraction is that they're not undead and that they've got this high combat speed, so they run into battle quickly. Yeah, like a lot of these kind of things that are small and not terribly hard hitting, but particularly because they've got an armor piercing weapon, if you can get strength of giants on a bunch of these, that can be very strong because it will significantly increase their strength. I think it almost doubles it, and that will, of course, scale very well with this armor piercing weapon. Going back to Conjuration, at a higher level, much higher level, level 8, so really very kind of late game magic here, or really if you're doing a very focused rush of research, you can contact a Vermin Lord. The Vermin Lords are the greater demons of the Skaven race. They represent the Horned Rat, which is their god, and they are consequently very powerful. They're also very expensive, so you need 4 Death and 4 Astral to contact a Vermin Lord. You can do that with a Grey Seer. You might, for instance, get a Grey Seer who's got 2 Astral and 3 Death. Give them a Skull Staff to get them to 4 Death, and then give them a Starshine Skull Cap and a Crystal Coin to boost up their Astral to 4. There's a few different ways you can do it, but they're not easy. You're going to need boosters and the like to get them. But yeah, 50 Death Gems, you get a Vermin Lord commander. So let's go and have a look at the Vermin Lord. Back to the summons preview site, the Vermin Lord right at the top here he is. So the Vermin Lord is quite similar to the demons and very powerful demons you can get in Dominions natively. He's got plenty of hit points, very high strength. He's pretty big at size 4. He has very good magic resistance he comes with. 30 morale, so kind of unbreakable. He's a great leader. He's got excellent leadership. His combat stats are excellent. Basic defense skill of 17 is very exciting for building any kind of defense build with him. He has built-in invulnerability 15, which is on top of his natural protection of 9, so it replaces it because it's higher, but if he is against magical weapons, he still does get that 9 base protection under there. But if you want to use him in combat, then you would probably want to have higher protection by sticking some items on him. He can't have a helm because of his big horns, but he can have a crown, so you can. There's various head slot items you can still benefit from on him, like you could put a Astral Skull Cap on him to get his Astral up and give him more magic resistance. He's got pretty nice paths. 2 Blood is useful for a few things. It's not the best self-buffing path, but it can be quite useful. And 3 Death. So 3 Death and 2 Blood, you could potentially put Blood boosters on him and use him to get vampires if you've gone up the Blood route. So 3 Astral, 3 Death, 2 Blood. The Astral's very nice because that'll give him access with a booster to teleport, so he's got the magical movement. It does make him a bit vulnerable to magical duels and things, but that's life. Importantly, he is stealthy natively, and he's got good stealth of 60, so that can be very useful for escaping from sticky situations, going in and out of forts and so on. He is extremely resistant to disease, like most demons. He has the demon tag, so he's vulnerable to things that specifically hurt demons, like Holy Scourge and things like that. And he comes with 5 fire resistance and 15 poison resistance, so very resistant against poison and a little bit of fire. He also causes fear, and his fear is boosted up by his death magic level. So natively, straight out of the box, quite useful for keeping things away, benefiting from any ore shields or anything you put on him. Basically, You kind of have to kit him out to use him in combat, but he's got a lot of stuff he can do. He's got pretty great paths, really. He is quite expensive, of course, and he's high research, but I think worthwhile getting some Vermin Lords. He might be your path to boosting up to a higher Astral or higher Death, but to be honest, you are likely to instead be doing that with your Grey Seers. Yeah, more of a kind of a luxury, powerful commander who is very survivable. He also comes with his built-in weapon, the Doomglaive, and Doomglaives are, to be honest, very nice weapons. They're basically a kind of forgeable level weapon. They are good length because they're 3, and then that gets boosted to 4 because he's size 4, so he can do repelling with it. They're very accurate. They hit super, super hard because he's so strong. So straight out of the box, without any other weapons, he can still smash things in the face and kill them. And he has a hoof attack as well. Now that can be a bit of a liability because it means he'll end up hitting into shields and things, but it is a bonus attack that can get you a bit more attack density from your square. I'm a fan of the Vermin Lords. Little bit of a luxury item. They don't give you fantastic like magic diversity or anything like that, although they do give you access to Astral and Blood to do things with horrors which you otherwise don't have from your recruitable mages. That's everything you have in Conjuration, and then in Alteration you have just the one spell, level 4. Level 4 in Alteration is something that you might want to go for anyway because you get Temper Flesh for anything you're using as thugs that have got Earth Paths, and Curse of Stones that you can cast with your Warlocks, which is sometimes useful if the enemy's not got very good magic resistance, and Destruction. And I think Destruction is pretty good with Skaven because it allows you to get through things with high protection, which is something they can struggle to do with their physical attacks. So it can be good against, let's say, Sacreds who've got resistance to poison and fire and shock damage. You maybe we're going to be using Destruction to get through their armor and just hitting them with Storm Vermin and things like that instead. Anyway, Warp Static is the spell. It costs a gem. It's not the easiest thing to cast. You don't have a huge number of Fire 2, Earth 2s. Your Warlocks, I think, often will be Earth 3 or Fire 3, but they won't. There's fewer. I think you'll end up with that are Earth 2, Fire 2. I can't remember exactly, but it's not super common anyway. What do you get? Well, Warp Static is kind of a weird spell. What it does is it hits a very large area of effect with a charge body effect, basically. So if you know Charge Body, it does a large amount of damage, shock damage, to anything that hits you. You also will take the shock damage, so it's like a shock explosion on you and the person that hits you the first time. So if you don't have shock resistance, you will be being hit by a large amount of armor negating damage, and it may well just kill you. It's also magic resistance negates, I believe. I might have to check this actually. Having had a look, it's not magic resistance negate. Anything that you cast this on will definitely get charged body if it doesn't already have it. But the combustion effect, that's just setting them on fire, is magic resistance negates. So if you cast this spell on things that have good magic resistance, they'll get charged body, but they won't catch on fire. If you cast it on things that have very bad magic resistance, they will get charged body, but they probably will catch on fire, which means they might just die before they get to set off the charged body. So if you think about the kind of unit you would want to cast this on, it's something that has very high shock resistance already, so that you are not hurting yourself when the charged body goes off when something hits you. Because you're getting hit on purpose, you might want to be using it on something that's somewhat expendable. You could also use it on something that's completely expendable in the sense that it doesn't have shock resistance and you don't care about it taking the shock blast from the charged body going off. You also maybe don't care about it being on fire from the combustion. So a way that you can use this is to cast it on like a load of giant rats, things like that, or a swarm of expendable units like Vermintide and so on, or just slaves, clan rats, etc. And it can output a huge amount of shock damage because charged body does do quite a bit of shock damage when something hits you from a unit that will, delete your unit as well, but it can end up killing like elite enemy units and things like that. It can even be threatening to thugs and super combatants and so on if they are something that is going to be physically hitting your units and something that doesn't have lots of shock resistance. So if the enemy doesn't have shock resistance, this can be extremely strong. It does take an Earth Gem, of course, and it's quite fatiguing. It's not the easiest thing to cast, but yeah, big area of effect. You can basically do it on a big chunk of giant rats and then let the enemy chop into them and the electricity will just explode out of them and blast the enemy. You have to be aware that a lot of them will catch fire and that sometimes can make an entire pack of rats run away because a bunch of them catch fire and get hurt or killed by it. So it's kind of a chaotic spell, which is very Skaven-y. It could be, I've not used this very much, and it could be that it turns out that this is a little bit too strong because it's just too much shock, in which case what I would do is probably reduce the area of effect a bit and maybe make it magic resistance for the charged body effect as well. Although then you would just cast it on rats that have very bad magic resistance. It can only be cast by Warlocks, Warlock Engineers, and Ikit Claw. I think it's very unlikely that Warlocks would have the paths to cast it, but Warlock Engineers certainly are the main user of it, and Ikit Claw is, your national hero Warlock, so you can do it too. Now we move on to Evocation, where you have quite a few spells. So Evocation, firstly at level 2, we have Minor Warp Lightning and Pestilent Breath. Minor Warp Lightning is 1 Earth, 1 Fire, so very easily castable by lots of your Warlocks and your Warlock Engineers, and Ikit Claw of course. It is also just restricted to them, so you can't use it with your other mages that have those paths. What does it do? Well, it casts 3 bolts of lightning, which this is very similar to the lightning spell, the Air 2 just lightning bolt spell, but you get 3 lightning bolts, so it's potentially 3 times as powerful as the lightning bolt spell. Its fatigue cost is quite low, and yeah, the downside of it is that it's inaccurate. It has -1 precision, so it's actually less accurate than a kind of neutral, and you're going to miss a lot with it. But it's pretty easy to cast. If you have lots of earth magic, it can be a useful thing to just chuck out lots of because it's not very tiring. And it can be quite tasty when the enemy gets in close range with you, where the precision doesn't matter as much because you're just getting more lightning thrown out. And if they don't have shock resistance, you can end up just blasting them. So it's pretty nice. It's also, there is a little bit of an advantage to very inaccurate things that just throw a few effects around, which is if you have your mages quite close up to the front of the battlefield, and they're casting this right at the start of the battle, sometimes they just end up hitting mages and things because it's so inaccurate. They're just throwing this chaotic, blasts of lightning all over the place. So yeah, I quite like it, and again, very chaotic. You will definitely cause some friendly fire if you're using it and your troops are in combat because it's so inaccurate. So that's something to watch out for. Then we have Pestilent Breath. Pestilent Breath is 1 death only and 1 holy, so you can cast it with your Plague Chantors, your Death 1 Plague Chantors. I was saying there wasn't very much you could do with them, and this is actually the probably the main thing you would have them doing, other than like Ghost Grips and stuff, is Pestilent Breath. Pestilent Breath is basically the spell Breath of the Dragon. If we look at that for a second, Breath of the Dragon, 5 poison damage going up, area of effect 3. Pestilent Breath is a little bit less damage and a little bit bigger area of effect. So very similar to Dragon's Breath, or Breath of the Dragon rather. Yeah, it's basically you vomit out a load of poison on them. It's not incredibly long ranged or anything, it's pretty short ranged, but it can be good to just put out more poison. I would say that it's not really a devastating amount of poison or anything. It's just enough to kind of wound things and maybe kill some stuff. But it can be a clutch spell in an early war where you've just got the mages that are able to cast it, Plague Priests and things, and you just hurl out a bunch of Pestilent Breath. The enemy doesn't have any poison resistance, they're going to have a very bad time. If they've got okay poison resistance, then they'll probably be fine and it won't do anything to them. But it can be good in an early war. And it's just a kind of a low fatigue thing to cast. Moving up to level 3, we get Minor Warp Scourge. So Warp Scorch is similar to Warp Lightning in that it has a minor and a major version. It's a bit more research for this one, and it's fire death rather than earth fire. So you want to be casting it with your guys who've got like a little bit of death and then plenty of fire. And it's basically kind of similar to a fireball, except it doesn't have a fly sprite. It doesn't like arc through the air and then land somewhere, which actually makes it a bit more accurate. It just causes an explosion somewhere. It does 11 plus armor piercing damage, and it's 2 area of effect. So yeah, it's a pretty easy spell to evaluate. If the enemy doesn't have fire resistance and you would be excited to do that much armor piercing damage to them, then it's good. If not, then it's not good. It's pretty straightforward. Having area effect 2 is quite nice. You can kind of think of it as like a bad version of Falling Fires. Falling Fires does more damage and has a bigger area effect, and the range is very similar, and I think the precision is very similar to Warp Scorch as well. Warp Scorch is actually more accurate than Falling Fires, but it just does less damage and less area effect. So you think of it as like mini Falling Fires, and one of the more accurate spells that Skaven can cast, which is quite nice. Moving up into level 4, we then have proper Warp Lightning. So we had the minor version, this is the big version. If you think about a lightning bolt, what's the big version of a lightning bolt? Well, it's a Thunderstrike. Thunderstrike obviously is quite a terrifying spell and well known, but it's also quite tiring. 50 fatigue and it's Air 3. Warp Lightning has a much lower base cast, but it costs an Earth gem, and therefore its fatigue is quite high. So you don't really want to be casting Warp Lightning with things with just Earth 1. You want to have higher levels of Earth. I would suggest using Summon Earth power to get your Earth up and to get the reinvigoration to wake you up after you cast Warp Lightning, because it can send you to sleep because it's quite high fatigue. But what do you get? Well, you get not quite a Thunderstrike, but an absolute storm of lightning bolts. So instead of getting the 3 that you get with the minor version, you get 13 plus. So that's the higher level of Earth. You get more of them. I think it's 1 extra. Oh, it's increased by 2 for extra level of the caster. Okay, so if you're at Earth 3 when you cast this, you get the base 13 for the first point of Earth, and then you get an extra 4, so you go up to 17 lightning bolts. So you can put out an absolutely massive amount. I've realised I was wrong to compare this with Thunderstrike. It's actually the even bigger version of Warp Lightning that's more comparable with Thunderstrike. This is more like Shockwave, I think, is probably the best thing to compare this with. Yeah, Shockwave is kind of similar. It actually uses area of effect rather than lots of individual small effects, but it's similar in terms of damage and hitting lots of things. So yeah, you can kick out a lot of damage. Shock damage, of course. It's lots of lightning bolts, and they're very inaccurate. So basically, the way to use Warp Lightning is you either use it at short range if you need it to be somewhat accurate, and it can put out a huge amount of shock damage, or you use it kind of at the start of the battle or at long range, and just cover the enemy in lightning bolts, and you can end up picking things off which you might not otherwise have hit. Again, very, very chaotic. Again, if you're using it when your troops are in combat, it's quite likely to inflict casualties on your own guys. So something to be careful with. And of course, it does take gems, so you need to be sending along gem carriers if you want to keep using this in battles. And evocations that use gems can be not the most popular things, although if you think about some of the better ones like Shadow Blast, you can kind of imagine the level. It's kind of a similar destructiveness that you can get out of Warp Lightning. It can be very good, particularly at close range. Then we move off into level 5, and you have the true Warp Scorch, so not the minor version. This is really getting pretty comparable with Falling Fires. It's actually a bigger area of effect than Falling Fires. The damage is similar. I think if you've got high fire, then the damage is actually more. Yeah. If you've got fire too, it's the same damage as Falling Fires. As you go up, it's actually more than Falling Fires, but it does now cost a gem. And so, of course, that makes it fatiguing. But big area of effect, pretty good precision for a Skaven spell, good range, better than Falling Fires, probably more damage than Falling Fires if you're using it with the right mage. It can roast things very nicely. I've realised I haven't put a warning on this one that it can only be cast by warlocks and so on, but I will put that warning on right now. Actually, I've made a liar of myself there. I'm not going to put the warning on because Warp Scorch, looking at my notes, is intended to be castable by things that are not engineers, warlocks and warlock engineers. It can be castable by Grey Seers, and that's intentional. Same thing as Minor Warp Scorch, you don't need to be a warlock to cast it. So you can cast this with some Grey Seers sometimes, although I don't know that that's the best use for it. But yeah, it's similar to Warp Lightning in that if you're at a relatively short range, it's pretty accurate, although Warp Scorch is just more accurate built in. It can hit a lot of enemies at once and it can put out a high amount of damage. But again, it can be a little bit chaotic. I would say it's the safer thing to use right at the start of the battle. If the enemy's not got fire resistance, you can do a lot of damage with Warp Scorch. Think of it as like a kind of long range, well, actually it's very similar range to Shadow Blast and kind of similar to Shadow Blast. It's not armor negating, but there's no magic resistance check involved, so kind of make it, comparable to Shadow Blast, firing off some Warp Scorches at the start of the battle. Moving on to level 6, we've got Greater Warp Lightning, and this is the final thing in the evocation tree. So Greater Warp Lightning is again a gem. It starts off at a much higher level of Earth, so Earth 3, Fire 1, just to cast it. It's pretty tiring, of course, but this is where the comparison with Thunderstrike is absolutely apt, because this is basically Thunderstrike. Instead of getting lots of lightning bolts, you're getting lots of Thunderstrikes. you know how powerful Thunderstrikes are. Presumably, if you play Dominions or watch Dominions videos, you've seen how absolutely devastating it can be. It's armor negating shock damage. It's a huge amount of damage, 26 plus, and very large number of effects. And each of them is a big, thick Thunderstrike that has an area effect of 1 and then has this Thundershock effect as well. So does the damage compare with Thunderstrike? Let's just have a look. 26 plus, and Thunderstrike is 26 plus, yeah. So they're basically big green Thunderstrikes. Pretty fatiguing because you need to have a high level of Earth to get away with not having lots of fatigue from this, and this starts out at 3 Earth, and of course it does cost an Earth gem unlike Thunderstrike. But this can be absolutely devastating. If you think about it firing off 6 or more, I think it goes up by 1 for every extra level. So if you are on 4 Earth, you get 7 Thunderstrikes out of this effectively. They are not accurate. They're all over the place because of the bad precision. Precision -1 as compared to Thunderstrike's built-in of precision 2, so quite a bit less accurate than Thunderstrike. But you can end up absolutely annihilating lots of elite stuff with Greater Warp Lightning. It's very strong. It's very fun to fire it off, but you are now getting up into the higher levels of evocation. I guess the advantage of this over Warp Scorch in particular is that it's easier for your opponents to get resistance to fire than it is for them to get lots of resistance to shock, and so Greater Warp Lightning is more dangerous to your opponents generally speaking. A very fun and very strong spell, and it looks awesome on the battlefield. Moving on to construction, we've got quite a few spells here. So starting out at pretty low level, level 2, we have Outfit Globadier Squad. I've already shown you the Poison Wind Globadier, so I'm not going to show you that again, but you get Poison Wind Globadiers from this. You get 4 of them, and it's only 4 Death Gems. You can only cast it with Warlocks, Warlock Engineers, and Ikit Claw, but this can be a very good way of, early in the game, getting a bunch of Globadiers. Let's say the opponent is rushing you. You've got up a little bit of construction. You've got the ability to make these with any of your Warlocks that have got Death and Earth. You can throw your Death Gem income into them, and you'll get troops that can throw out poison orbs and very severely hurt or kill things that don't have poison resistance. So very useful indeed. The outfit Warp Fire Thrower spell is very similar. It's 1 level higher at level 3 in construction. It's fire and death to cast it, and you get only 2 of them for fire gems, but of course they're individually more powerful than the Poison Wind Globadiers. This is again one where if the enemy has having a bit of problem with the headset. If the enemy has rushed you or you're in an early war, then this can be an absolutely clutch spell because you can quickly get a bunch of Warp Throwers together. Otherwise, you can only get 1 per turn per fort, of course, so early in the game you don't have that many forts and you need the resources for making troops. It can be quite a bottleneck, and so being able to quickly get some of these through these spells is very nice. Doomflayer is the same thing for Doomflayers, so it's 4 gems, you get 2 of them. I would say that this one in general is a worse idea. Doomflayers are probably one of the weaker weapons teams. They're not as destructive, but they're more reliable in the sense they don't annihilate your own troops and they can hold the enemy in place and kind of help your infantry out. The problem there being that Earth Gems, I would say, generally are worth more than Fire Gems. So I'm not so keen on doing this, but it can be useful to just get some to help your infantry out. Moving up a level, you then at level 4, so you're getting the greater magic items now, which is where you're getting the really good stuff. And this is a thing that you'll quite quickly want to get to level 4 construction, I would say. You then get the ability to do the Poison Wind Mortars and Warp Lightning Throwers. They're 5 gems each. Warp Lightning Throwers you get 2 for 5 because Warp Lightning Throwers are basically a bit better than Warp Fire Throwers. So yeah, you have to go further to get those, but you can get them. And Poison Wind Mortars, very similar, you get 2 for 5, so you can get some Poison Wind Mortars. Not much more to say about those are pretty straightforward. We then have 2 more spells in construction. The Construct Doomwheel spell, which again can only be cast by Warlocks, and it is 2 Earth, 2 Fire to cast, and 10 Earth Gems, so quite expensive. If you think about it in terms of Warp Lightning Throws, you could be getting for more Mage turns, but for the same Earth Gem cost, you could be getting 4 Warp Lightning Throws. The Doomwheel has a very similar use to Warp Lightning Throwers, putting out huge amounts of shock damage. So let's go and have a quick look at the Doomwheel. Back to the preview site. Here is the Doomwheel. This used to have a really terrible graphic, but I've, in relatively recent months, improved the graphic, and I'm fairly happy with it now. I think it looks kind of cool. You can see the whizzy bits on it. So Doomwheels what's the best way to describe them? Well, they're on the one hand, they are like big chariots that trample things. They've got a bit of unsurroundability. They've got trample. They're big, size 6, so very good tramplers. And they're very fast, which is also great for being tramplers. So pretty good tramplers. Although they are undisciplined, which is a bit of a problem. You can't tell them to, hold and attack rear or anything like that, or really position them. They just go off and do what they want. And what they want to do is actually not to trample most of the time. What they want to do is go off and fire off their warp lightning. They've got big warp lightning generators on them, which means they get to fire off these 2 shots. One of them is range 20, and the other is range 10. So often they will fire the range 20 ones from long distance. They get a shot with that, well, 2 shots in fact, because they've got 2 ammunition. And then after that, they'll move out closer, and then they'll fire off the one at range 10, and they get 1 shot with that. So it's kind of the dribs and drabs from their energy generator. Their long range shots do 8 armor negating shock damage. There are 12 of them, and they're over quite a long range, but they're very imprecise. So it's a big spray. It's very similar, basically, to the Warp Lightning Thrower. So it's like having big upgraded Warp Lightning Throwers just spitting out tons of shots. They do that twice, and then they'll move in and they do 1 more. And this one is even more attacks, 18 instead of 12. But shorter range, of course. But because they've moved in closer by the time they use it, it's actually often around the same level of, or even, in fact, even more precise than the other one. So they can do some pretty devastating blasts with these. But you have less control over them than you do with the Warring Thrust because they're undisciplined. After they fired all these shots off, they'll then run in, roll into combat and start running things over. And if you look at their stats as a trampler, they're actually pretty amazing. They've got a good amount of hit points. They've got the extra unsurroundability and so on. Their stats are not like very exciting or anything, but they do have pretty high protection built in. So they're not the easiest things in the world to take out for the enemy. They'll just roll around smashing things. They're by no means indestructible, and considering their like relatively high research and cost lots of earth gems, you will find that Doom Wheels will die fairly often. But they can be great if you've got enemies that are vulnerable to both shock and being trampled, like certain elite heavy infantry, sacreds and things like that are. Then they can be amazing against them. It's also just nice to have access to things that are size 6 to stand up to stuff like big air elementals. If you can work out where the air elementals are going to come in, they crash into Doom Wheels. They will do very little against the Doom Wheels because they have 20 shock resistance, so basically immune to shock damage. And they're size 6, they can't be trampled by air elementals. That can be a nice trick. The other nice thing about them is that in addition to their unsurroundability and the fact that they count as being mounted, so they have halved harassment penalty and extra defense, is that they're actually not too bad at all at just repelling stuff. They've got these attacks that have so this is their kind of main attack, the Warp Blade. If they run into something else that's size 6, they try and hit it with a Warp Blade. It does a decent amount of damage. It's not anything that exciting, but it does a decent amount of damage, and if it does manage to do damage, then you get an extra bit of armor negating shock thrown in there as well. But these are the kind of exciting thing, these 3 Warp Spike attacks. So the Warp Sparks do a capped single point of damage, which itself is not that exciting because we're talking about 3 points of damage potentially here. So it's armor negating, but whatever. The thing that's exciting about them is that they have high attack and are length 4. So these 3 attacks, all of them can be used to repel. So this can keep it alive quite a bit better against melee enemy, particularly if they have bad morale or if they have bad defense. It can just end up warp sparking them and keeping away, constantly repelling them. So it's kind of to represent that if you want to get in and hit the Doom Wheel, you have to put up with the fact that there's lots of lightning coming out of it all the time. Going back to construction, we then have nothing at level 6. And then at level 7, which is, it's in between powerful magic items and getting artifacts, but it is a level of research that people often go to get weapons of sharpness. Mechanical Men is quite exciting because mechanical men have poison and fire and shock resistance, I believe, so they're very good to use with the Skaven area of effect stuff you can fire off. And you get Forge of the Ancients potentially. You also maybe could do Golem Construction with the Skaven, but I'm kind of digressing here. The point is that you get Construct Screaming Bell, and the Construct Screaming Bell is pretty simple to cast. A Grey Seer can cast it. 3 Astral, 2 Death. So what do you get for that? And 36 Astral, which is fairly expensive, but not wildly expensive. So what do you get from the Construct Screaming spell? You get, go back to the preview site, Screaming Bell, an upgraded Grey Seer, basically. But in addition to being an upgraded Grey Seer, so having a bit better magical paths built in the Grey Seer, because he has just a chance of getting Death 3, or a chance of getting Astral 3, or a chance of getting Fire Mage level 2. He's got all of them. He also has Priest level 4, which can be quite exciting. Just having more Holy 3s is always good, but Priest level 4 is very nice. He comes with built-in pretty high fear. Although you're unlikely going to be using the Screaming Bell as a thug, it's basically a Grey Seer on top of a big contraption. What you'll probably be using him for is his excellent spells. Having Priest level 4 can be good, but excellent magic paths for the cost 36 Astral, and you get these magic paths is quite exciting actually, although you may not have, Astral is kind of a precious resource. But what you also get is a Dominion Spreader, so you get an extra bit of spread and ability to preach and so on out of these, so that can be quite useful. You also get Inspirational 2 and Good Leadership. So this is a huge amount of morale that he can give to the things he's leading. So if you do still have troops that you want to give lots of morale to, then the Screaming Bell can be very good for that indeed. He is old. He's suffering the effects of the kind of strain of breathing in this Warpstone brazier and sitting on top of the Screaming Bell and so on. You can also see that he's got a better version of Fortune Teller. I believe it's Fortune Teller 13 on the basic Grey Seer, but here we're getting up to Fortune Teller 21, so pretty powerful levels of Fortune Teller. There's also two abilities which are not listed here, and I will add a note at the bottom of the description for the next version of this mod so that you can see it more easily, but they cast faster. They've got a 33% increase in their casting speed, which can be quite exciting for casting these various spells. The things you can get out, big battlefield spells and things, the faster you can get them off, the better. So having an extra casting speed is very nice. And they also have one temporary death gem in every single battle, so that's you can only use it in the battle, but you get a free death gem, and that can be useful for casting things like some of their national spells that require death gems, or big things like Rigor Mortis, stuff like that. So pretty strong. Slightly different slots from a Grey Seer. He doesn't have any feat slots because he's standing on top of this, and that's standard for things in chariots and stuff like that. So no boots for him, but that doesn't typically something that the Grey Seers use that much. So is that worth 36 Astral Gems at level 7? I would say that it is. It's a way of getting basically more and more powerful versions of your capital-only mages, so it can be quite strong. And of course, having Dominion Spread is always very welcome too. Though you do have blood sacrifices, so you can do that to get your Dominion spreading around. So moving on into enchantment next. We've got 3 spells to talk about in enchantment. At low level, level 2, we have Skitterleap. Skitterleap is identical to Gift of Flight, except that Gift of Flight, I believe... No, it is identical, yeah. It's basically Gift of Flight, but it's a lower level, and you cast it with Death Paths. This I have found very useful in games that I'm playing because you can use it to send things on attack rear, flying to the back. So I use it to send Storm Vermin and Council Guard and things like that to the back. You can also use it to give Gift of Flight to Sensor Bearers, who can act like kind of flying poison bombs to things at the back. You can even give Gift of Flight to your mages and things so that you can more easily run away at the end of the battle. You can use it to give Gift of Flight to thugs if you've got like Banes or Bane Lords and you want to give them flight with that, or even you've got a Titan Pretender or something, you can give it Gift of Flight. It can be a little bit difficult to use Skitterleap because you can't always control exactly where they're going to be casting it, and the mages will often cast it on themselves. But I have found it very useful generally, and just a very nice option to get some extra flying troops in there. Then we have Favour of Nurglich. Favour of Nurglich is 1 death, 1 holy. You can only cast it with your Pestilence Plague Priest, I believe. Yes, so the Grey Seers cannot cast this. It's only the Pestilence things, like Skrulk, Nurglich, Plague Priest, and Plague Chantors. Can cast it with Plague Chantors, but it is very fatiguing for them because it takes a Death Gem, which means it costs 100 fatigue, and they don't get any reduction because they've only got Death 1. What do you get for that? Well, you basically get poison resistant, the same as you would from Serpent's Blessing, spells like that, except that you get it in an area of effect and it costs a death gem. It's a way of getting poison resistance on your guys. I quite like this. Obviously, you can use it to counter foul vapors, but I think the more common usage for it is just to make sure that your troops don't all die from the poison you're throwing around. If you've got lots of poison wind globadiers, if you've got casting Pestilent Breath, things like that. You can use Flavor of Nurgle to keep your troops alive. It can be a little bit difficult to use, and of course it's a bit fiddly because of the gems, but generally very strong and kind of a national strength. Then similarly we have Death Frenzy. It is 2 Death and 2 Holy. It can be cast by anything that's got those paths. It's not restricted to a particular type of mage. It costs 1 Death Gem. And Death Frenzy is a large area effect. Magic resistance negates Berserk. That's all it does, is it berserks things, but being berserked can be very useful. So you can use it on things that have bad magic resistance, and the AI will naturally favour casting on things that have bad magic resistance to make them berserk. It only affects your own guys, but you can cast it on, say, a load of giant rats, and then you don't have the problem with the giant rats running away, and it also makes them better at hitting, more strength and more attack skill. You can use it on all kinds of troops can benefit from being berserked for the Skaven. Yeah, generally very strong. The fact that its magic resistance negates means that it typically won't accidentally berserk your mages, even if they get caught in the area of effect. And it means that it will favour things with the low magic resistance, so slaves and rats and things like that. I think Death Frenzy can be very useful. Some people regard it as almost essential to play as the Skaven. They quickly go up to Death Frenzy because it can make your low morale troops stick around in battles. That's everything in enchantment. So some useful spells there, and enchantment is definitely a path that you'd want to go up in order to get your like skelly spam and stuff like that going. And you could potentially also get flaming arrows by going up enchantment and using your fire mages to get that with your Skaven slave slingers, as we talked about a bit earlier. Now in Thaumaturgy you have nothing, but you may be wanting to research in that to make use of your good astral magic and so on. And then in blood magic you have quite a few spells. The first is Moulder Pit Breeding. It's at level 2. Moulder Pit Breeding is identical to Crossbreeding, except that it's a tiny bit cheaper, it's 2 slaves less, and it's blood and earth instead of blood and nature. It can only be cast basically by your Moulder guys. You can cast it with things that aren't the Moulder ones if you happen to have any other mages that are that, but that's your Moulder mutators, the ones that come with those paths, so they'll basically be casting that. Use it in the same way you used crossbreeding. If you need fodder, the Skaven always like to have more fodder that they don't have to pay gold for, so it can be quite strong for just getting fodder for holding up forts and things. I guess you could argue that the Skaven are already so good at making chaff and fodder and like siege units that it's less important for them, but I think you can use it to phase out stuff that costs gold, and it can be a useful alternative to using lots of giant rats, so it's not bad. Then at level 3 we get Breed Pestilence Plague Rats. So for Blood and Death 1, and it can only be cast by Pestilence mages, and 8 Blood Slaves, you get 10 Plague Rats. What are Plague Rats? Well, let's have a look. Back to the preview site. Here's the Giant Rat, here's the Plague Rat. Looks very similar, but on close inspection you can see that it's got the lurgy. He's got all boils and pustules and things all over him. Plague rats are basically exactly the same as giant rats, except they have a very special weapon, the Plague Bite. If the Plague Bite manages to do damage, and it manages to pass a difficult magic resistance test, then they will be given disease, and also they will be given plague. So disease is itself like an unpleasant thing that can happen. Obviously, it's particularly bad if it happens to like elite troops. You don't want those to be diseased. If you're the enemy, if you're the Skaven, you love to disease your enemy troops. It can be very nasty on super combatants, particularly on pretenders, things like that. But plague is different from disease. Plague is like the spell plague, which means that it does immediate damage to them. It starts like kind of making them fall apart into a bubbling mess of goo, and it can spread from one unit to another, and it can spread to friendly units as well. So if you send these guys in and they manage to get some bites in, and the plague does manage to spread, which can be quite tricky to arrange, but it's possible if they're out there biting things, then you can end up with the plague spreading even through huge armies and doing massive quantities of damage and killing loads of stuff by the end of the battle. It is slow to kill things, it's not super fast, it's almost like setting everything on fire basically. But yeah, it can spread and it can be absolutely devastating. But that's very unreliable because of the nature of the unit we're talking about. However, they are very cheap. I mean, it's 8 blood slaves and you get 10 of them. So if the enemy is kind of moving this big army through, you can often be throwing in plague rats into kind of sacrifice forces or trap forces to just charge in there, in amongst other chaff things, and get some hits in maybe, and then spread the plague through their army and cause a lot of disease and damage to them. So a good kind of falling back kind of attrition weapon that you can use. Going back to Blood Magic, at the next level, level 4, we have Breed Rat Ogres. So we did have a look at the Rat Ogres before, so I won't go into a great deal of detail there, but it's 10 Blood Slaves, 1 Blood, 1 Earth, so it's going to be cast by your Molder Mutators, basically, and you get 3 Rat Ogres. It's not designed to be extremely cost effective, this, for massing large numbers of rat ogres or anything. It's just to give you some extra rat ogres. You could potentially build up quite a few if you've got a quick blood economy going. I think later in the game, rat ogres are less exciting than other things you can do with blood, but they're not terribly expensive at, 3 and a bit slaves each. I think that they actually can fight, unlike things that you get through Molder Pit Breeding and so on. But yeah, it's not like aggressively costed. I might consider. I'm going to basically keep an eye on the cost of this, and maybe it needs to be cheaper or work slightly differently, or something along those lines. But I think for now it's okay where it is. Moving up to level 6, this is your final 2 national spells that I'll talk about. We firstly have Improved Molder Pit Breeding, which is very easy for me to talk about because it is identical to the spell Improved Crossbreeding, but it comes 2 levels earlier, which is very good because Improved Crossbreeding is like pretty high level for what it actually is. You basically get a bunch of crossbreeding as you normally would, except that you've got a much higher chance of getting bigger and better monsters from it. This is identical to Improved Crossbreeding, but of course it's 2 blood, only 1 earth. So you need a blood booster or something like that on your Molder Mutator to cast it, but then it's very easy to cast. You've got the higher chances of getting good stuff. You get 40 plus effects for 20 slaves instead of the lower level, which gives you 20 plus for 13. So it can be more effective because you're getting the better stuff. Basically, it replaces that lower spell, but you need a boost to cast it. Can be fun. It fits in with the Skaven theme of randomness and everything. Then finally, we have Mix 1,000 Poxes. This is 2 blood and 3 death. So you will be casting it with, for instance, a Plague Priest with 2 boosters, a Skull Staff and a Brazen Vessel or something like that. It costs 77 blood slaves, which is very expensive, but you do get something very good by casting it. And we will go, you can only cast it with pestilence things too. And let's go and have a look at what you get. Back to the summon site. We get the Cauldron of 1,000 Poxes. Cauldron of 1,000 Poxes is another one of these. It's like the Screaming Bell. You get a mage who is kind of a powered up version of a typical recruitable mage, and they come on a big chariot thing. So what do we get from the Cauldron of 1,000 Poxes? Well, 3 death built in, and then you can put a booster on there like a Skull Staff to get to 4 death. 2 blood built in, which is nice. So this is another potential avenue to doing, much like the Vermin Lord, you could use this to get into vampire summons and things in the blood tree. It is much like the Grey Seer on the Screaming Bell. It's an inspirational leader, but it's not really as much of an army leader. It comes with a big old poison cloud constantly surrounding it, which can be quite bad for stuff that's standing around. It's a Holy 3, which can be quite nice. It's a Dominion spreader, much like a kind of Juggernaut effect and the Screaming Bell. So think of this as kind of the alternative to the Screaming Bell in a way. But the thing that's really strong about it is that it casts Foul Vapors in every battle, and I will put in an extra bit of info here just to make that clear, much like I'm doing with the Screaming Bell, that you get Foul Vapors at the start of every battle that the 1,000 Poxes is in. So if you think about how useful Foul Vapors traps can be generally, I mean this is higher research than getting to Foul Vapors, but you can't cast Foul Vapors with the Skaven naturally, but you can get this. You get Foul Vapors for free in every battle, and it starts immediately. There's no delay of waiting to cast it or anything like that. There's no problem with getting the right paths or having the mage fatigued out or anything. You just for free get Foul Vapors in every single battle where this is taking place. You can't double up on it. It is legitimately the same spell as Foul Vapors. You just get Foul Vapors Battle Enchantment. So also if this is killed, you lose the Foul Vapors. But yeah, that can be very strong. It does all the same things that Foul Vapors does. And this, of course, has very good poison resistance built in, so it's pretty resistant to Foul Vapors in the first place, as a lot of your other stuff will be. Is it worth 77 blood gems? Blood slaves, rather? I would say so, to get Foul Vapors in multiple battles. 77 blood slaves is not the same as 77 magical gems. They're a lot easier to get. So yeah, I think very worthwhile going up blood just to get these. That's it for the national spells. Lots of different things to consider. Quite a good spread of things amongst different schools. The only one that doesn't have anything is Thaumaturgy, I believe. And let's talk about the Pretender selection next. Skaven Pretender selection is quite an eclectic mix of all different types of beasts. A lot of them are death themed or disease themed. We've also got some blood themed ones in there, and yeah, just quite a big mix. There's quite a few titans they can have, and lots of monsters. That's kind of their strongest area. They also have some national pretenders. So let's start off at the top. We have the Pillar of Commandment. This is an immobile Dominion 4 pretender. You could compare it with like a more expensive version of the Golden Pillar or the Monolith. That's probably the most sensible things to compare it with. It is a big, immobile, very tough to damage and destroy pretender, like a Monolith type one. It comes with a wide selection of magic paths, although new magic paths are very expensive, and it comes, of course, with Dominion 4. So if we compare it with the Pillar of Commandments, you get 3 Earth. Sorry, the Golden Pillar, you get 3 Earth there. The Monolith, you get these 3 paths, but the Pillar of Commandments, although it's quite a bit more expensive, does come with 4 paths. It also has some interesting built-in things. So it's very tough, of course, and it's got all these excellent resistances. But it also has a built-in Banefire shield that does 7 AP damage, and that's can be quite strong if people are attacking it. If you manage to teleport the Pillar of Commandments on top of somebody, or they end up fighting it, then the Banefire shield can be a very nice thing to have and very nasty for your opponents to deal with, because of course it does fire damage that goes. It's armor piercing and it can go through things, but it can also cause decay. So that's an option. Then we have at Dominion 2 the Keeper of the Pillar. So this is another expensive one, same price as the Risen Oracle. Comes with 3 paths and is basically a Vermin Lord. So very similar to Vermin Lord stats, I think slightly better than a Vermin Lord and a bit beefier. Even though they're size 4, you can kind of compare them with the Titans and things, which are size 5 typically in terms of hit points, very tough. It's got some built-in invulnerability, which can be very useful, and it's got a couple of nice weapons. Although it's worth noting you don't have any hand slots, so you can't replace those weapons, and you can't give them boosters and so on, and other useful things that go in your hands. But 2 Bane Blades is a pretty nice thing to be carrying around. So yeah, possible option there. And then moving a bit further along, we have the Arch Plague Lord for 190 points. So 190 points is kind of comparable with kind of things. Serpent of the Underworld is 180. Raven Underworld's cheaper. Ghost King is maybe a comparator because Ghost King is rainbow-ish with new paths costing 20. This is new paths costing 80, so not really rainbow-ish, but does come with Death and Blood. Really going to be focusing in Death and Blood. You could maybe do a Death and Blood less that is more aimed towards your Pestilence things. That's kind of the idea here. This is the Pestilence themed Pretender. Pretty good leader with good inspirational and capable of thugging because it's got Poison Barbs, Poison Cloud, Recuperation, which is quite nice for avoiding having afflictions end your expanding and things like that. Built-in fear. Lots of different attacks, although this does have 1 hand slot, the one that's not carrying the Bubonic Scepter. The Bubonic Scepter itself is quite nice in that it can do huge amounts of poison damage. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this as an expander, but it's an option for expanding. Maybe you would want to take it just to go down a Death and Blood less. But again, I'm not really kind of going into a guide of what you should select, I'm just showing the options. And then finally, we also have the Dominion 1 option, the kind of rainbow option, the Seer Lord, and they do have that rainbow style new magic paths cost of 20. So that's the same as these other things like we have the Crone, so it's more expensive than the Crone. You've got slightly more new magic path cost than the Crone, more like the Ghost King in terms of that. And you come with some built-in useful abilities. Damage reversal can be very good, very strong. 12 is a fairly difficult check for magic resistance to pass, and that will completely reverse damage rather than both people taking it. Fortune Teller 25 is quite nice to avoid some events and things. But this is really just a souped-up Grey Seer is the best way to think about the Seer Lord. I'm not sure how useful these paths are in terms of Bless, and they're obviously not so useful in terms of access. It's an okay researcher as well. Yeah, just really more of a thematic option. It's quite rare for me to do Pretenders for Warhammer Nations. It's not something I typically enjoy doing. People often ask why I haven't done more or why I haven't done them for the other nations, or like when am I going to do them for the other nations. And the truth is I don't particularly enjoy doing them, and I think that Dominions gives you lots of cool options already to be the Pretenders, and Pretenders don't really map that well onto things from the Warhammer lore. But so some of these are kind of just more of a flavour thing than something that I would really recommend taking. So that's your Pretender options. When you start a game as the Skaven, you will get a welcome message, which will appear on the very first turn of the game. Unexpected events occurred in Skaven Blight. And you get this welcome message. This is just to explain the single unusual mechanic that the Skaven have, which is Warpstone seams. So every turn in any province controlled by the Skaven, there's a small chance that a Warpstone seam will be discovered. I believe it's 2% per province. A site which provides 1 fire, 1 earth, and 1 death gem, but also increases unrest. It's 3 unrest it generates per turn, so not super high. And you get this excellent income of gems from it. So the Skaven will end up, if they control a bunch of territory, quite gem rich, and that can be useful for powering all of your spells that require gems and doing your forging and so on. Quite a big national advantage. There can only ever be 1 Warpstone seam in a province, so you don't get 2 at a time. Each turn there is a chance it will become an exhausted Warpstone seam because the Skaven have mined all of the Warpstone out, all the bits they can get. And this chance is greatly increased if the Skaven don't control the province. So if the enemy take them over, they'll get a little bit of income from them, but they'll quite quickly close down. And the closing down event that the enemy gets actually reduces the unrest as well, because everyone's happy that the Warpstone seam has been shut down because people are scared of Warpstone. Exhausted Warpstone seams do not provide any gems or create any unrest. They're just like a flag, a placeholder site, and they prevent more Warpstone seams from being found. So it's just as you would expect. Once it's exhausted, you don't find a different one. You just have to wait for this one to potentially be reopened. There is a chance of it being reopened, but only if it's controlled by the Skaven and there is a lab present. If there is a lab present there, you get one of 3 events. You may get one of 3 events in the province. One of them is that the lab is fine and they managed to reopen the Warpstone seam, which is good for you. One of them is that the lab is destroyed, but the Warpstone seam is put back open again. So that cost you 500 gold, but now you've got this gem income back, although you do have the unrest. And the other chance is that the lab is destroyed and they fail to reopen the Warpstone seam, which is very bad. So if your Warpstone seams do close down, you can build a lab there if you want to try and push gold into making more gems, which can be a useful thing to do, but it's a little bit unreliable. But I think it's sometimes worth doing if you just want to have more gems, build a lab there. Sometimes you get a lucky event and end up with a lab there or something like that, and then you'll end up with Warpstone seam back open again. So overall, this makes some more chaos for the Skaven, but means that they have more gems available generally, and also there's a little bit more unrest in their lands, which maybe would push you towards more using order in your scales. Just as an example, here's what the finding of a Warpstone seam event looks like. So we can look in Grunwald and see what this has given us, and here's the Warpstone seam site. So there you can see the gem income and the unrest. So now we've talked about everything about the nation other than what scales I would suggest. And again, this isn't a guide, so I'm not saying this is the correct build. I'm not really going to consider what Pretender there are, but what scales would generally work well with the Skaven and which ones would be thematic. Well, I think that taking high production makes sense for the Skaven, either 2 or 3. That's because it gives you the resources available to make the most of some of your resource sink troops. It allows you to quickly make troops at the start, maybe for expansion, and it also gives you the resources you need to build those several 1 per fort per turn war engines, such as the Warpfire throwers, Warp Lightning throwers, and Doom flayers. So having production, I think, is pretty much a no-brainer. Heat and cold scales, it's up to you. Obviously, the Skaven's natural preference is for 0, so you can min-max as you see fit there. I would say that I would take order scales because you want gold, and also the passive unrest reduction can be useful for countering the Warpstone seams that you'll have. It can also be useful with blood hunting, which you're going to be doing a fair bit of probably. I would take reasonably high Dominion because I think that getting your Dominion out there and passing Dominion checks and so on is a good idea, just to make sure that your troops are fighting in positive Dominion. You do, however, have blood sacrifices you can do, so you could go with a strategy where you take kind of low Dominion and rely on the blood sacrifices. You could also, if you were taking a super high bless, dump loads of your scales and then just rely on blood sacrifice to get the Dominion in the right places. But I think that your capital-only sacred is better than your build-only sacred for things generally, and taking a high Dominion score will allow you to build quite a lot of your Council Guard, so I think I would take it reasonably high just to get more Council Guard. They're not very expensive, so that'll be the limit on them largely, is the Dominion points that you have. Should you take Growth or Death? I would generally say Growth or Neutral, because you're going to be doing blood hunting. The Growth could be used for that, and I think it's somewhat thematic for the Skaven to take either, really, but you could justify Growth in the sense that they are this surging population constantly bubbling up, and you could also justify Death in the sense that the Skaven tend to just strip mine and destroy and disease everything around them. Fortune or Misfortune? Well, given that you're probably already taking Order, I would say maybe Misfortune is a place you can save some points. Also, the Skaven are famously destructive and always causing catastrophes for themselves. At the same time, I guess they are sort of a lucky group in that they rely on this kind of chaos and mad inventions and things. Sometimes they have these strokes of luck that enable them to succeed. I generally would say a little bit of Misfortune, perhaps. And then Magic or Drain, again, I think you could argue thematically either direction here. The Skaven are kind of technological, so which is maybe pushing them more away from the world of magic. And they're not necessarily naturally magical creatures, but they are chaos influenced, obviously, and they are very fond of magical experiments, and they love to chomp down Warpstone like it's big chunks of cheese. So you could justify magic or thematic grounds. In terms of mechanical benefits, well, having high magic would mean that you would be recruiting lots of your cheap things like the Plague Chantors and other cheap researchers, whereas having Drain, you would prefer to go for the Warlock Engineers, who concentrate a lot of research points into a single commander. So, yeah, mechanically, I think either way. A lot of people would say take the something like an Awake Pretender with the Skaven because they're very bad at expansion. I don't know that that's necessarily true. I think you can make do with a Dormant or Imprisoned one as well. I think the Skaven can do expansion. You just have to accept that you're going to take lots of damage and make clever use of your weapons teams. That's more or less everything I have to say about the nation. I hope you've enjoyed this overview. I know it's quite a long one because there's been a lot to say about them, and because I do love the Skaven quite a lot. It was the first mod nation, Warhammer mod nation I ever made for Dominions. Some of the sprites are a little bit long in the tooth because of that, but I still have great affection for them, and I think other people do too. So yeah, I would recommend giving the Skaven a go if you're interested. I hope this has kind of whet your appetite to sink your teeth into some Warpstone in the game of Dominions, and I hope that you'll enjoy further videos and national overviews from me. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.